am Mayor Pro Tem Rachel Friend, and thank you for joining us for the Thursday, November 10, 2022 study session of the Boulder City Council. We have up for tonight 2 agenda items. Number 1, an update on the Transportation Core Arterial Network. Pausing here to say thank you to Sarah Huntley for hitting record button. And number 2, discussions around how to schedule and prioritize our work over the coming year on planning and development services. And then I think we're also adding a 3rd item, which will be a quick staff update on vote results from Tuesday. So the first 2 items might not sound that exciting, but honestly, this is where local government lives and breathes: buildings and roads, and how we help community members to move around safely and get people housed. So we've got a lot of exciting stuff to cover, but first, an announcement, and I think we have a slide for that. Thank you. Okay, so it's just a reminder about COVID testing and vaccinations. You can go visit boco.org/COVID testing or /COVID vaccine for more information on either testing or vaccinations, both of which you can still get for free. And I believe that's all of our announcements for tonight. Yes. Okay, so now we're going to go right into the meat of the meeting. The first item up will be the Core Arterial Network. You will also hear us refer to it as CAN for short. This is slated for discussion for 75 minutes. So staff will give a presentation, and then council members will have a chance to ask questions, and then we will discuss and offer feedback. I will note that Councilmember Matt Benjamin is absent tonight, but he did send in feedback via hotline. And if anyone watching does not know how to access hotline communications, you're welcome to reach out to any of us or to the clerk, Elisha, and we can help you out. And then I'm about to turn it over to our city manager, Nuria Rivera Vandermeide, to introduce our first item. But before we do that, I also just want to take a moment for all of council to have the chance to congratulate one of our own, Junie Joseph, for winning a really big and important election on Tuesday. So jazz hands for Junie.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else before over to Nuria? I'm sure we all join in congratulating you. Nuria, baton.
Thank you very much. Thanks council for, I think we've got 2 great items today. And also I know that a lot of folks have been watching the results of our local elections, so we're happy to chime in at the end. I'm going to send this over to our wonderful interim director of transportation and mobility, Natalie Stifler, to kick us off. But I also just want to mention, we received, and I know council did as well, a great letter from TAB, our Transportation Advisory Board, and wanted to publicly thank them for their support of staff's work. This has been truly a collaborative effort, and I am super pleased to see this work move forward and showcase all the great work staff has done, but know that that has also been done in collaboration and conversations with TAB as well. So just wanted to say that out loud. Natalie, I'll send it over to you.
Thanks, Nuria. Good evening, council. As Nuria said, I'm Natalie Stifler, the interim director of transportation and mobility. And I wanted to introduce Valerie Watson, the transportation planning division manager. She'll be presenting the update on the Core Arterial Network efforts to date with you this evening. And I also just wanted to take a moment to say how proud I am of our department for the pivot they took to expedite our focus on the CAN over the past year. And I really want to express my gratitude to Valerie, Garrett, and Devin and the entire department for their impressive work, and that I think you'll also find impressive tonight. So with that, I will hand it over to Valerie.
All right, thank you so much. And I think council staff will be putting the presentation on the screen momentarily. All right, thanks so much. Good evening, Mayor and members of council. Valerie Watson, Transportation Planning Manager with the City of Boulder. I'm joined tonight by Garrett Slater, Principal Transportation Projects Engineer, and Devin Joslin, Principal Traffic Engineer. Next slide. Tonight, I'll be offering an update on the department's work plan for the Core Arterial Network, along with some updates on active CAN corridor efforts and where we are at with community engagement and design for our baseline road priority corridor, followed by an update on our funding strategy. Lastly, we'll talk about next steps. Next slide. All right, let's take a look at our work plan first. Next slide. This map remains our North Star, the CAN corridors and study areas prioritized for our department by council in January of this year that we will work to initiate or complete over the next 5 to 7 years. Next slide. We have updated our work plan schedule to reflect more detailed information on active corridor progress since our July presentation. You can see both the original April version and the revised September version in the memo attachments. Of note for our conversation this evening, we've broken out baseline into 2 phases now that we have successfully secured funding for the project through DRCOG Transportation Improvements Program, or TIP Call 2. We've also tentatively adjusted the timeline for Folsom Street and the Downtown Mobility Study. With Folsom currently a candidate for TIP funding, this affords us an opportunity to rethink the timeline and the overall CAN funding as well. Plus, as you'll hear from our colleagues in Planning and Development Services later tonight, there are a number of planning efforts ongoing or upcoming that focus on connectivity, land use, and the public realm downtown. Moving up the schedule for initiating the Downtown Mobility Study component of the CAN work plan allows us to get a jump start on dovetailing with related city efforts being led by other departments and community partners. And we'll talk about this a bit more later in the presentation. Next slide. All right, now let's take a quick look at some project updates. Next slide. We're on track with our priority corridors, and kudos to the department staff and community partners who have worked diligently this year to continue this accelerated cadence. And a big thanks to all of our members of the community who have provided feedback throughout our summer and fall engagement activities for Baseline Road. Earlier this year, we launched our community engagement and design process for Baseline Road, and we'll go into detail tonight on the progress with Baseline. Staff are ramping up internally to initiate community engagement and design after the new year for Iris Avenue. So we're now in the pre-design phase of project development for Iris. And Folsom is now a candidate for TIP Call 4. So we're seeking funding through the DRCOG Transportation Improvement Program for design and community engagement. And we will be bringing this project along with other staff recommended projects to council for endorsement at the December 1st City Council meeting. If awarded, those funds would allow us to initiate that project as soon as Q4 of 2024 and free up the local dollars that we need to address our current efforts along Baseline and Iris. More on funding later. Next slide. And we're also on track with other active projects along the CAN, which is really exciting. As detailed in the memo, there's a lot of ongoing work that we will see final construction activities for over the next 3 years. For example, early next year, we'll celebrate the completion and full opening of the 30th and Colorado underpass and protected intersection. Next slide. All right, now that we have a feel for progress on the overall CAN initiative and work plan, let's take a look at where we're at with Baseline, the first of our 3 CAN priority corridors. Next slide. As we presented previously, there are a wealth of community assets and populations along Baseline. We've been working to reach people with the lived experience along the corridor to offer their insights on what it's like traveling along Baseline today. Next slide. In line with the city's racial equity framework, we also met with the city's community connectors and residents in September. We gained valuable feedback on our engagement plan and local contacts and business owners in the neighborhood. The community connectors and residents also provided feedback on their personal lived experience of traveling along the corridor that we will also take into consideration in the design process. Next slide. Here's where we're at with Baseline. We're now in the conceptual design phase of the overall project development process. As we synthesize the community feedback we've received to date, combined with our existing conditions analysis and pre-design work, we will start to identify potential project elements for either phase 1 or phase 2 of the project, and a little more on those phases in a moment. Next slide. First, let's review what we've accomplished so far with community engagement. In August and September, we had a questionnaire and information materials online, and this questionnaire on Be Heard Boulder closed September 30th. We have reviewed over 400 responses from that. Next slide. We also hosted our own events and tabled at other events in the neighborhood where folks could fill out paper versions of the questionnaire or mark up maps to document their experiences traveling along the corridor. In August, we held a transportation safety fair for children and adults, partnering with Boulder Community Health to distribute free bike helmets and lights, along with nurses who help families with helmet fittings. There was music, ice cream, face painting, and balloons. And Community Cycles and Boulder Police also joined us to connect with people at the fair. Next slide. We were joined at the Transportation Safety Fair by John Zimmerman from Active Towns, a prolific journalist who captures walking and bicycling culture and street design issues across the country. And here are some vignettes he put together of what he captured. We're going to play you a quick video.
Bear with us for a minute, Council. We're having to switch screens to get the video up.
Hi there, I'm Nathan Pope with the City of Boulder, and we're out here at the Back to School Baseline Transportation Safety Fair. We got bike lights, we got maps. We're asking folks how they got here today and if they need any lights or anything else for their bike journeys. We also are kicking off a project where we're looking at improving safety along Baseline Road. So whether you're walking, biking, driving, or taking the bus, we want to hear from folks and really looking to improve safety for everybody on Baseline Road.
There. But yeah, if I have the option, if there's not a lot of pedestrians or anything, I'll ride on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
As opposed to in the street.
How come not the bike lane?
Doesn't feel safe?
Doesn't feel safe.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah.
If we had a little protection in there, a barrier between the travel lane and the bike
That would
lane,
definitely help.
Okay, great.
Well, I wouldn't travel on Baseline with these guys in tow, just because there's...
You wouldn't?
No, the cars are going really fast.
Okay.
Yeah, they're definitely exceeding speed limits.
So you're down in the bike lane there?
I would do that on my own, but I wouldn't
not
do
with
it
the
with
kids.
these guys.
If there was a barrier protected bike lane where there's actually physical barrier between you and the travel lane, would you then ride it?
100%.
From a safety standpoint, somebody earlier was explaining to me that one of the things would be to potentially improve the separation between anybody who's on a bike or a pedestrian and the cars.
Yeah.
And so I think if there's a way to put up maybe a concrete barrier or something to make that a clear delineation, that probably is a good move safety-wise.
Run over people trying to get around the boat.
And so we've had a lot of comments from parents and kids about places where they'd like to see improvements for crossing. And they've been describing how they feel unsafe, where drivers might not always be looking out for them when they're crossing. We've also heard a lot of comments that people are riding their bicycles on the sidewalk because they're not feeling safe biking along the baseline in the buffered bike lane.
All right, thanks for your patience while we bring that presentation back up.
Boulder.
All right, thank you so much to staff for helping out with that so you could hear those voices. All right, moving on, in September, we were a part of the CU Boulder Bike Fest where we were able to connect with a ton of CU students. We also held community walking and bicycling tours, inviting some of our community partners at Boulder Walks, Community Cycles, and Center for People with Disabilities to co-host. As mentioned before, we were also able to speak with the city's community connectors and residents in September. Next slide. Early November, we released a slew of information materials on the project, along with summaries of what we've heard from the community, a virtual on-demand open house. At the Baseline Project website, folks can access these materials and the ArcGIS Online story map that walks you through background on the project's phased approach, what we've learned from the community, and how it's being folded into the design process, and what might change on the corridor, specifically what project elements are under consideration. We also feature an online comment form for the community to give additional feedback and offer office hours online with city staff for those who prefer to give feedback through conversation with the project team. Next slide. To keep community members in the project area engaged and invite their participation with the on-demand virtual open house, we have sent mailers to over 3,000 residents and 168 businesses, and those should be hitting mailboxes as we speak. We have also shared an informational flyer with our key partners like CU Boulder and offered to print and distribute these if that works better for reaching folks. We also created a Spanish language project fact sheet that's available for download and in print. Next slide. So what have we been hearing? There are several themes that are emerging as we continue to synthesize the feedback we've received and consider it as we make progress on the conceptual design for phase 1 of baseline. Folks are noting their perception of high vehicular speeds and large volume of vehicles traveling along baseline and how that relates to safety for other people driving, walking, rolling, and bicycling. Several responses noted that as drivers, they feel afraid turning onto or off of the corridor because of other drivers speeding. They're afraid of being rear-ended or sideswiped. We're also hearing an array of comments about street crossings, things like not having enough time to cross the street, long crossing distances, being difficult to navigate with all of the people walking, riding bikes, scooters, skateboards, and such in the relatively narrow crosswalks. Comments have also indicated that people driving are not always yielding to people walking in crosswalks with the right-of-way, and that there's a lack of crossing opportunities for long stretches of the corridor. In terms of bicycle safety, folks are reporting that they do not feel safe in the existing protected bicycle lane with the roadway striping and flexible delineators, those white posts. They're instead riding on the sidewalk or taking circuitous routes through the neighborhood to avoid baseline. We've also heard comments about the game of leapfrog while bicycling that happens when buses are passing and then pull over to the curb for passengers. Next slide. Community members have highlighted that it's difficult to get to destinations along baseline and also difficult to connect to surrounding infrastructure. Folks have noted that the sidewalk and roadway pavement condition is poor, which is particularly noted in relation to the bicycle lane and crosswalks. In terms of transit, folks have noted that there's a lack of basic amenities at transit stops and sometimes poor visibility when waiting for the bus due to vegetation growth. In general, many responses noted that the roadway noise and lack of comfort walking along the corridor and waiting for the bus, which is an indication that vehicular speeds are contributing to an inhospitable environment. Next slide. All right, so much amazing feedback to work with, and thanks again to our community partners. So now let's talk about how this project will roll out since we are successful in our DRCOG TIP Call 2 application for baseline. That will allow just under $4 million for comprehensive multimodal capital intensive enhancements. We are approaching this project in phases. In phase 1, which we aim to complete next year, local dollars will be used to add physical protection or hardening in strategic prioritized locations to upgrade the existing bicycle lane that is today demarcated from the adjacent travel lane with striping and flexible delineators. Pavement resurfacing will also be completed in phase 1, along with these upgrades to the existing bicycle lane. We will also have the opportunity to restripe the roadway to narrow travel lanes, a proven safety countermeasure to reduce vehicular speeds. We're also looking at how to improve the buffer along the existing bike lanes west of 30th to 28th Street. Although local dollars are limited for phase 1, staff are currently synthesizing existing conditions analysis along with community feedback to prioritize the strategic locations where the bike lane protection upgrades will have the most impact for safety and comfort for people bicycling, as well as better organize the street for all users. The intent is to implement these prioritized locations for bike lane hardening next year as an interim measure to gain the safety benefits now, while the city awaits that availability of the DRCOG TIP funds for phase 2 as early as Q4 of 2024. There are also some related safety projects at spot locations that will happen concurrent to phase 1, funded by HSIP, which I'll cover in more detail on the next slide. Then phase 2, the award of DRCOG TIP funds for phase 2 offers us the opportunity to deliver more comprehensive multimodal capital intensive improvements, such as completing the bike lane protection implemented in phase 1, additional intersection and pedestrian enhancements, and transit efficiency improvements. Next slide. We also wanted to cover that there are some related safety projects at spot locations, either recently completed or slated for next year. The completed projects were implemented from 2018 to 2021, including a raised crossing at 29th Street, protected left turn phasing at 30th Street, and centerline hardening, plus a leading pedestrian interval or pedestrian head start at Mohawk. Next year, we'll likely see the implementation of 2 federal HSIP projects, which will begin design later this year. One will close a driveway in order to realign and signalize an existing pedestrian crossing at Canyon Creek, and another will implement protected left turn phasing at Mohawk. Needless to say, this corridor has already been on the radar for our transportation operations engineers, and these related projects will complement the bike lane protection upgrades and other improvements currently in design for phase 1. Next slide. Okay, now let's talk a bit about funding and how that relates back to our updated work plan schedule. Next. As you remember from July, we repurposed funding from local streets, specifically for our 3 priority corridors. Next. As we have advanced further in the design process for baseline, we have now started to assign funds for specific priority corridor efforts. In general, the approach for the CAN funding strategy is to use local funds for design and community engagement. We will generally seek external grant funds for construction. Where we can, we will use our repurposed local budget for some initial installation of prioritized design elements, such as the upgrades to bike lane protection in phase 1 of baseline that we talked about earlier. This will likely be the approach for IRIS as well, but additional grant funds or local dollars may be required for the IRIS initial construction budget once the project design is initiated and the corridor needs and feasibility considerations are explored in greater detail. Pending the results of the DRCOG TIP Call 4 application to be submitted in January for Folsom Street design and community engagement, staff are considering how to initiate design on this corridor in the event that this application is not successful. In that case, staff would consider requesting funds in the 2024 departmental budget or seek future grant funding opportunities. Next slide. So we've really focused a majority of our grant funding efforts this year in response to the CAN. Most, if not all, of our grant pursuits relate directly to CAN corridors. For example, the cycles of DRCOG TIP are focusing on key connections in the CAN, such as 30th, Colorado, and Folsom. Considering the projects that have been recently implemented or are already in final design, we've made tremendous progress on securing the future of these efforts. Next slide. And we've secured over $6 million in grant funding for the CAN so far this year, and are hopeful our applications for remaining corridor segments in TIPs Call 3 and 4 are successful as well. We just heard that one of our 2 CAN-related applications in Call 3 was tentatively recommended for funding this week, and we're recommending several CAN corridors be submitted in Call 4. Next slide. Other external grant opportunities on the horizon could offer additional funding for remaining CAN corridors, such as Federal Safe Streets for All, CDOT's Transportation Alternatives Program, Revitalizing Main Streets, Safe Routes to School, and Federal Highway Safety Improvement Program grant funding. And we'll continue to look for moments where we can integrate CAN work with our ongoing programs, such as pavement management and Vision Zero. Next. So as we mentioned earlier, if our TIP Call 4 application is successful for Folsom, we will see that funding become available to start that effort up in Q4 of 2024 at the earliest, which pushes this corridor a little further out on our work plan schedule. For consideration tonight, we'd like to hear council feedback on the idea that we discussed in the memo to advance the downtown mobility study a little sooner. It was previously slated to start in 2024 to sync up with other city-led planning efforts around downtown that you're going to hear more about from Planning and Development Services later tonight. But we could get a head start on this towards the end of next year if our schedule on Folsom is relaxed. While we don't have funding secured for the downtown mobility study yet, that is something that we can look into once we have a better sense of timing, and we would need to request local funds for that in 2023 or 24. Next slide. Right now, let's talk about immediate next steps for the CAN initiative. Next slide. We will be continuing work on baseline, gearing up for IRIS, and assembling the TIP Call 4 applications. Next year, we'll initiate our public process for IRIS, and we're looking at summer for implementation of baseline phase 1. Next slide. Again, we're interested in hearing feedback on the updated work plan and funding strategy this evening, as well as your specific feedback on the downtown mobility study schedule shift that's contingent on the fulsome pre-design effort being successfully funded under TIP. And with that, we're now available to take your questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Okay, I'm going to move my screen so I can see hands. Who's got questions? This would be a first, and I feel like I'm failing. Does really no one have a question? Thank you, Mark Wallach, saving me.
This is just for you. Will the baseline improvements involve shutting down baseline for any extended period of time?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Anytime there is pavement resurfacing that comes along, we will have periodic lane closures, and we'll make sure to notice, the community members and businesses are immediately impacted by that, to make sure that everyone is aware of what that schedule would look like. Garrett or Devitt, is there anything you'd like to add?
This is Garrett Slater, Principal Transportation Projects Engineer. So as a matter of practice, we generally try to avoid total closures if at all possible. And if we do, as is evidenced by the recent closure that took place at 30th and Colorado intersection, we try to keep them as short as possible to limit the impacts of the adjacent residents, businesses, and general community. For baseline, we don't fully know the scope of work that might entail the various construction impacts to the road, but right now we don't foresee any full closures, and as Valerie indicated, most likely it'll be intermittent lane closures.
Okay. The reason I ask is looking at Broadway during the construction for the hotel, you had real traffic jams. I felt like I was back in New York. At various times of the day, and to the extent that we can minimize that, I think it would be very valuable for the community.
I appreciate that feedback and recognize that that was definitely an inconvenience.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Tara.
Yes, my question is, and I think a lot of the community members like me who ride up and down Baseline on our bicycles would have the same one. I did learn something new. I believe Canyon Creek is a street I never heard of, but is that right? It's actually right near that crosswalk, that flashing crosswalk. So look, I learned something new. Awesome. Tell me if you're going to keep that flashing light situation, how do I even put this, that is so dangerous because cars never see that. It's hard to see those flashing lights. So there's always a possibility of an accident. Are you going to be updating that, or is that the way it's going to stay?
So there is a capital project that was identified on one of the exhibits that Valerie shared. Mm-hmm. And so that baseline of Canyon Creek, which is actually located sort of to the east of 29th and west of 30th, right? It will shift the location of that crossing, and thereby the flashing beacons that will be accompany that crossing. And the intent of that is to increase the visibility of the crossing for approaching motor vehicles.
That's great. And you said in your presentation, you're going to close one of those openings, I guess, in the Sprouts parking lot. Is that it? Because there are so many openings.
Correct. And I think Devin has an additional comment there.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Devin Joslin. I'm the principal traffic engineer, and my team is overseeing that project. And Tara, that project will actually be replacing the flashing beacon there, the RRFB, with a full pedestrian signal. So it will become a full traffic signal that pedestrians will need to push the button, wait for the signal to change, and then cross the street. But it will control traffic in the same way as a regular traffic signal.
I'm so excited. That's my last comment.
Thanks, Tara. Nicole.
Yeah, this is a process question that may be more for Nuria or Natalie, perhaps. And we got this email from Tab that really highlighted a lot of the things that are going well on this project. I think our lack of questions also highlights that too. And I mean, my question is more of sort of a process question around what did we as council do right for this to go so well, or is this just, you know, staff being amazing as they are? But I'm just, you know, I'm curious about this because it seems like we're ahead of schedule. We're talking about adding work. This seems pretty phenomenal.
I'll jump in quickly before Natalie does, because I want to just say that part of it is staff is amazing. But I'll say too, and Natalie, I'll let you kind of continue it here. From the initial conversations when you all were discussing this, at least from my perspective, one of the important things, and we don't always do this well, is that we agreed to stop doing some things, right? It wasn't an and conversation. It was this actually seems more of a priority. It will impact more people. What do we need to do to make this move forward? And I think that was really helpful with your support at the retreat as we were talking about it. And then that really enabled staff to sort of pivot as they did, and then work closely with Tab to move that forward. But at least from my perspective, that is a critical component of doing some of this work and really sort of adjusting to new priorities as they emerge. But Natalie, I'll send it over to you.
Yeah, I'll just build on what Nuria said, that it definitely is, I would say one of the primary reasons is because we were very clear that we needed to stop doing a few things if we were going to pivot to this work. And I think the data, right, supported that pivot. But I'll also say that hasn't been easy. And I know several of you get these messages and staff gets the messages. I mean, we're on a weekly basis still with folks in our community that really want to see speeds reduced in their neighborhoods as well. And it's hard because we have to tell them that's not our focus right now. And we're not making improvements in that area. And the data supports that, but it is not an easy thing to do. So, you know, this all looks amazing, and it is amazing, but there still are those hard conversations happening, you know, on a weekly basis regarding that trade-off. And I would say that another piece of it is also that so much of what we were already doing so much of this work. It was the story that we, you know, I think struggled to tell. And now we've been able to really coalesce around a story. And so a lot of the amazing work that we've been doing, now you're hearing about it, the community's hearing about it, and we're doing it in a strategic way. So I think that's also a big piece of it. And certainly Valerie, Garrett, and Devin, you know, feel free to add to that.
Thank you. It's really helpful just to get that sense. Thank you.
Nicole. Okay, seeing no other questions, let us turn to discussion and answering staff's questions. So maybe we can just start with a question, well, see if anybody wants to have a general discussion item first. Show of hands, is it okay if we just move right to answering staff's questions? Fab. Okay, so question number one, does council have any additional questions about CAN priority corridor progress in 2022? I'm going to assume that's a no because no one had any even general questions. We usually just ask. Okay, so question two, does council have any feedback on the updated work plan and funding strategy? Who's got feedback? Once, twice, gone. Awesome. Any feedback on the question of advancing the initiation of work on the downtown mobility study component of CAN from quarter 3, 2024 to quarter 4, 2023, contingent on successful funding of Folsom, redesign application, and Dr. Cog tip monies. Any feedback on staff moving that up a year? Aaron, then Bob, and Tara's got a thumbs up already. Thank you, Tara. Aaron.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It sounds like a good idea. And I'll just, while having said that, also say just how much I appreciate the amazing work that you've done here. You know, Tab sent us that email earlier today, basically just talking about the 14 different ways that you all have done a phenomenal job on the CAN network, and just want to add my thanks on that. And then also to highlight what Natalie said about part of how you get a success like that is by letting some things go, right? There's always trade-offs, there's always hard choices, and I think we're going where the data leads us in terms of safety and for travel in our community, and you all are doing a phenomenal job. And some of the successes on getting the Dr. Cog money are just amazing. So I think you're just 100% on the right track, and really appreciate all the amazing work that you're doing.
Thanks, Aaron. Bob?
I agree with what Aaron just said. I'm just wondering, I know that there was some of this in the memo and some of this in the presentation. I'm just wondering if, since we're running way ahead of schedule, if staff can take a few minutes and elaborate a little bit more on what the mobility study will cover and kind of what the scope of that might be. If you want to just maybe say a few more words about that.
Natalie, do you want to start with a preface on that?
Sure, I'm happy to, and then others can chime in. So we haven't scoped to this. I'll say that's my big preface. What I think some of the things we've talked about as a department is that, and with our colleagues, across the organization, is that there's an opportunity to look at all of the one-way streets. Is that something that we want to continue to have as a strategy for our downtown circulation? And then also looking at how do we, if we want protected bike facilities within the downtown, how do we accommodate for that? Where does it make sense to have protected bike facilities in the downtown? Really just, and even thinking about transit, right? Where does transit fit into the downtown? We certainly have a history of the HOP serving downtown. And I think there's an opportunity to just kind of ask ourselves what we've had for an access and mobility strategy for the downtown for the last several decades. Is that still relevant? And so that would be, I think, at a high level, what we would be thinking about.
Thanks, Natalie. That was helpful. And will part of that, I know you're just starting to scope it now, but will part of that also include maybe connectivity to the Hill or adjoining areas?
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks.
Bob, anyone else on question number 3 to answer? So, I mean, I agree. I think this is a testament to staff that this is humming along marvelously. So thank you all for the work. And I also want to give a special shout out to Alex Weinheimer from TAB, who really helped us to forge the whole concept of CAN and brought the data and some of the initial visualization of it. So I think, Nicole, to your question, that's part of what the magic was too. So thanks to everyone. I think we're done with this agenda item unless staff has any questions for us.
Natalie, I presume you and your team have what you need.
We are good. I think so. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Thanks, everyone. And while transportation is here, I got a text just now that says that there's a light out at Baseline and Foothills, which seems like an important light to have on. So Baseline's up again. So reporting that. Right, we're on it together.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we'll get on that.
I don't know if it's even true, but it's here, so now you have it. Okay, so let's move. Let's hope the second agenda item is just as fantastic as this one in terms of beating our pace and all of us getting along and paddling in the same direction. So second one is going to be planning and development services and how to schedule and prioritize our planning work items over the coming year. We have 2 hours and 15 minutes scheduled for this. So I guess buckle up or do the opposite and stretch your legs. And we'll have the same format as before. We'll get a staff presentation, then we'll have council questions and discussion or not if it goes like last time. So back over to Nuria, please, for introductions.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll say, well, we have all that time. We don't need to take all that time. So feel free to save some time for post-election wrap-ups, right? This has been, and this is not new, right? We have talked a lot about all the projects on PNDS's plate. And I'll say that some of those projects actually involve, as Natalie was saying, some of our other departments across the organization, and hoping that we can, through this conversation, that you'll be able to see all the amazing work that PNDS is doing. It is a phenomenal amount of work that they've had, both that was already started and as they're coming to some of those to a close. I think you'll see some of that. And then trying to find ways to accommodate some of the new work plan items, knowing that council certainly has an interest in pushing us forward in really interesting and novel ways to make some changes for our community for the benefit of all. So with that, I will ask our Director of Planning and Development Services, Brad Mueller, to take it away.
Thank you so much, Nuria, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem Friend and council members. We are truly excited to come forward to you this evening and be able to have a discussion around these many items. And we appreciate the time and space to be able to talk about this. This is truly a collaborative effort in every sense of the word. We are going to deviate a bit from the norm and do a lot of tag teaming, so you're going to hear from many of us. As Nuri mentioned, I am the Director of Planning and Development Services, but we will also hear from Charles Farrow, who is our Senior Planning Manager for Development Review, Christopher Johnson, who is Senior Planning Manager for Comprehensive Planning, Carl Geiler, who is our Senior Policy Advisor, Lara Kars, who is a Principal City Planner, and Lisa Hout, who is also a Senior City Planner. We're going to be tag teaming as I mentioned along the way. Please advance the slide. Really, we would encourage you to think of this in two pieces. We are going to be doing a bit of a deep dive on accessory dwelling units and Boulder Junction Phase 2. You'll recall that we were in front of you a couple months ago about Boulder Junction Phase 2, where you gave us direction on the scope, and we're going to give you what that looks like now that we have that direction and moving forward. An accessory dwelling unit similarly has a long ramp that's led up to this date, so we're going to do a deep dive there. And then the other part of this presentation will really be speaking to the other 6 items that we've listed as well. Next slide, please. We wanted to have this presentation and this study session really so that we could have an honest conversation with you, Council, about how we can best deliver a win for you, a win for the community, a win for the department as well. With 5 of the 10 council priorities that you set last January being within planning and development services, we have worked hard to make sure that we develop an approach that we achieve as many of these as possible. In the spirit of honest conversation and transparency, we need to admit that we lost some staff capacity this last summer, and actually into the spring already. We lost 4 senior planners for good reasons, a couple retirees and 1 moving to another department, which we always support that personal growth. And we did anticipate a couple of those changes and were able to replace them. But that replacement took some time from our overall effort, maybe about 3 months or so in practical terms. I really want to give a shout out to Charles, though. We were able to fill all of those positions in very short order with senior staff. And in fact, 3 of those 4 are returning staff members from previously working, and Charles was beating the bushes and just very successful on behalf of the department and city in bringing those folks. Sarah, who you'll hear from tonight, was that 4th person, and she's hitting the ground running too. We couldn't be happier to have her with us. We also have had to work in an environment where developer review and building permits have been as high as they ever have. That has been tough, and we've had to make some decisions in that regard regarding workload. As you know, we've been hearing from the public about the turnaround times on those and made a decision to have staff, Carl in particular, who you'll hear from tonight, move over to do development review and try to just balance that so we're also addressing that very urgent need as well. I will say to Council that we very much appreciate the additional staff that you approved as part of the budget, the additional consulting dollars. We actually jumped ahead on trying to get those additional staff hired even before, if I'm allowed to admit this, the budget was fully approved. And
Brad, you're not supposed to share all our secrets.
please retract that last statement. And, and know that I think we even made an offer on one of those today. So we are working hard to be able to hit the ground running, both with experienced staff coming back and hiring as quickly as possible. We absolutely, council, have a bias towards action and completing things. But again, we want to have an honest conversation with you about what we can balance. Part of our presentation, and you saw this in the memo, too, was showing where we can do intermediate wins that are possible as well. So next slide, please. Some of these are geographically based. You can see that on the map here. Many of them are not. So this is just the broadest overview possible. And if going to the next slide, please, we will conclude with three questions to council, rather, about both the scope of ADUs, the scope and any further comments on Boulder Junction Phase 2, and then the larger recommendation and alternatives, I should say, about prioritization. So with that, I am going to do the first of several handoffs to Lisa, who will present the first of our two bigger topics, and we'll continue from there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Brad. Good evening, council members. My name is Lisa Hood, and as Brad said, I'm a senior city planner with Planning and Development Services. And I have the honor of several slides related to our ADU code revision updates. So I'm going to go through those. As you know, the ADUs were identified as a work program priority at the beginning of this year at your retreat, with the objective being to increase the allowance of ADUs in our community. Specifically, the direction we got from council was to do targeted updates, specifically on removing the saturation limit and also allowing both attached and detached ADUs on one lot. We also received direction to analyze potential remaining barriers to ADU construction. And how we did that over the last couple months is we completed an evaluation of the most recent changes to the ADU regulations that were approved back in 2018 and put into place in early 2019. So over the last few months, we've been doing a lot of data analysis, conducting internal stakeholder interviews with all of the staff that work on ADUs in the city. And then we also had a survey of all of the ADU owners in Boulder. Starting out with some background, ADUs have been in place in Boulder since 1983, when the first ADU ordinance was adopted. So you can see through this chart the number of ADUs that were approved each year since then, and kind of the major regulatory changes that happened along the way. You can see over the last few years, there's been a huge spike in the number of ADUs approved after those changes were adopted back in 2018. So we've been seeing record numbers of accessory dwelling units being approved and built in Boulder over the last few years, even through the pandemic. For that evaluation, we really dug into those last few years to try to understand what changes really made the most impact on accessory dwelling units in Boulder. So we looked at the time period from when those changes went into effect on February 1st, 2019 through kind of mid-summer. And the total was 200 ADU applications that were approved in that time. We've had 96 ADUs that have been completely built. There are 44 currently under construction and 32 in permit review. Since we kind of had that stop date of July 31st, I just checked today just to see how many have been approved since then. There's been 12 additional approved since July, just for reference. But in the evaluation, we looked at that time period and we looked at a number of characteristics of these ADUs to understand them better. Almost 2/3 of ADUs in that time were detached, which means they're separated from the structure of the main house on the lot, and then 83 of those were attached. We looked at the average size of accessory dwelling units, and that was coming up, and these are the ones that have been approved since 2019. That comes up at about 640 square feet. We do have different allowances for detached and attached, so the average sizes for those differ as well. We also looked at the affordability of accessory dwelling units and found that 67 of those approved were affordable ADUs and 133 were market rate. We also focused on the saturation limit, knowing that that was specific direction that was given by council to understand, because in 2018, one of those changes that was made was an increase in the saturation limit from 10% to 20%. So what the saturation limit does is set a cap on the percentage of ADUs allowed in a particular neighborhood area. And so in 2018, it increased from 10% to 20%. And we wanted to understand what impact that change had on the number of ADUs approved over the last few years. About a quarter of those ADUs are in districts that don't actually have a saturation limit, so that change didn't impact them. And then over 50%, over half, actually still met the previous saturation limit of under 10%, so that change didn't impact them. However, 41 accessory dwelling units in the last 3 years had a saturation limit between 10% and 20%. So those are ADUs that would not have previously been approved prior to those changes in 2018. While we looked a lot at the data for these approved ADUs, we also wanted to understand what the barriers might be for ADU construction in Boulder for the people that might never go forward with an application, but might be submitting inquiries to the city or considering an accessory dwelling unit. What we found by looking at the inquiries that we received through our customer service portal, Inquire Boulder, is that the majority of questions that we get related to ADUs is about saturation limits. So this is definitely a part of the code that is poorly understood by our residents. It's information that a homeowner is not able to get on their own. So they have to reach out to the city, and the city then a staff member has to calculate the saturation limit for them to understand if an ADU is even possible on their property. So that's just one of the main concerns with saturation limits. I included some quotes from these actual tickets that came in just to give you kind of the flavor of what people are asking. People do seem to understand that there is a saturation limit, but because there is no way for them to know what the saturation limit is of their neighborhood and particularly their parcel, they aren't sure if they're even able to, dip their toes in the water of building an ADU. So I think the one in the top right really represents a lot. We would like to consider an ADU over the garage of our home, but we need to confirm that the location is not saturated first. How do we do that without submitting a whole application, submitting the fee, things like that? So that's really where we're getting a lot of questions about saturation limit and spending a lot of staff time answering those questions and calculating that limit. In addition to completing the ADU evaluation, we've also been doing a lot of research on comparable cities around the country. There's a whole matrix in your packet that you can take a look at for over 30 cities and what their ADU regulations are, but I did just want to highlight a couple key takeaways. The first being that we cannot find another city in the country that has a saturation limit for ADUs. So I think that that's important to reflect on. The saturation limit has been in place since that original ordinance for ADUs in 1983. And while certainly 40 years ago, ADUs were a new land use concept and there were concerns about potential impacts of introducing these accessory dwelling units into our cities, we now have over 40 years of experience with ADUs, and like many cities, these impacts can be mitigated in other ways, such as zoning standards or compatible development standards, all of the other things that ensure that any potential impacts are mitigated. Also, a couple other key takeaways. Only a few of the other cities that we looked at actually have a minimum lot size for ADUs. Definitely the cities that have undergone recent updates to their ADU regulations seem to be going away from having a minimum lot size, so that's kind of a common trend. Almost all cities do limit it to only one ADU per lot, so that was interesting relative to the specific direction that was given. Boulder's maximum size of detached ADUs is actually, we found that to be smaller than most other cities in the country. Although if you look at the maximum sizes in Colorado, a lot of the cities in Colorado kind of tend to the smaller side. But generally nationwide, typically it's closer to about 800 square feet, or they use a percentage of the principal structure. There's a lot of variation on cities and the parking requirements for ADUs. Often it's either 0 or 1. Some cities will waive the parking requirement if the location is close to transit. Almost all of the cities say that the ADU cannot be sold separately, and about half require owner occupancy. So there's a lot more detail in the full ADU evaluation, and I encourage you to take a look at that. That's something that was always planned to occur when those changes were adopted back in 2018 and to inform future code changes. So that's why it made a lot of sense to do it as we were thinking through this upcoming work program priority. But this is kind of an overview of the conclusions that the evaluation comes to. So looking back at the changes that were made or adopted in 2018, we found data to support that the changes that really did reduce barriers to ADU construction in Boulder included the changes to the saturation limit, increasing the maximum size. For the saturation limit, as I mentioned, about 40 additional ADUs were built because of that increase in the saturation limit. For the maximum size, the increase in 2018 was only 100 square feet larger for detached ADUs, but we saw that over 3/4 of the detached ADUs that were built actually exceeded the previous maximum size. So that had a really significant impact on the amount of ADUs that were allowed. Minimum lot size had a more limited impact. About 16 properties that would not have previously been able to put an ADU on their property were able to once the minimum lot size was reduced from 6,000 to 5,000 square feet in 2018. And a couple additional zoning districts were allowed to have ADUs back in 2018, and that resulted in 2 ADUs that wouldn't have been previously allowed. The evaluation also illuminated several remaining potential improvements that we think as staff would further reduce the barriers to ADUs that exist in Boulder and really meet the objective of this council priority. Number one, as noted, eliminating the saturation limits. We think that that would reduce a very significant perceived barriers for homeowners around Boulder, as well as a real administrative issue and burden for both staff and property owners, just in the overall timing and efficiency of the process. Also recommend, or some of the other improvements that we think would further reduce barriers would be reconsidering floor area and the way that ADUs are measured. I won't get into the nitty-gritty zoning details, but ADUs are measured differently than any other structure in the zoning code. And so that creates some inefficiencies and confusion with applicants and homeowners that could be clarified. Additionally, considering another increase in the maximum floor area, we think would result in additional ADUs. Some other things like extending the length of time that ADU approvals are in place before they expire, we think would help, as well as adding an option to increase variance or to increase height through a variance process, as we've seen several recent applications run into issues when they're trying to adapt an existing structure that is over the height. And then you'll see in the ADU evaluation, there's a lot more detail about the code clarification and process improvements. As we went through all of these stakeholder interviews, there are a number of issues that are pretty minor code clarification cleanups that could be made that could fix some common problems and really increase user friendliness. So things, just general things like reorganizing, using some different language. A lot of the language remains from 1983. So just updating it, making it more modern and in line with how the rest of the code is coming up to date. There's also some things that aren't code changes that could really make a difference. So process improvements, such as streamlining and expediting approvals that we think could make a big difference. In regards to community engagement on the project so far, so we worked with our great colleagues in Housing and Human Services to put out a survey of all of the ADU owners over this past fall, early fall, September and October. And Housing and Human Services has done this survey several times. So we have comparable data from both 2017 and 2012. So it's a really interesting way to see how attitudes about ADUs have changed over time and how these ADUs are being used in our community. We got 212 responses, which is a 48% response rate. So that's a really great representative sample of these ADU owners. And again, there's a lot more detail in the ADU evaluation, but some highlights that I wanted to just feature is that compared to previous years and previous surveys, there is a greater percent of ADUs currently that are being used as space for visitors or relatives rather than additional housing units. We also found in that survey that, or we asked what the reasoning was for someone pursuing the affordable route, the affordable ADU, and 40% of owners chose to do affordable instead of market rate in order to reduce their parking requirement. Finally, we asked if owners would be interested in pursuing a second ADU, and 77%, over 3/4, said they would not be interested in a second ADU on their lot. I did also want to highlight that the Housing Advisory Board has been discussing ADUs over the last few meetings. They did come up with a recommendation, which was included in the packet. And then we've received several public comments, which you all have received as well through email from various community members related to this as well. And the engagement plan will be further developed based on the scope of the ADU changes as the conversation emerges tonight. So just a final slide. The staff is recommending to continue along with this targeted scope that was recommended from the beginning, but to change a little bit of the main topics or slightly tweak the main topics. So focus on eliminating saturation limits as discussed at the retreat, but also adding in a reconsideration of floor area. This is something that came up in almost every avenue of this evaluation as something that remains a barrier to additional ADU construction in Boulder. So whether that's increasing the maximum floor area or simply fixing the measurement, the unique measurement quirk of ADUs, that's something we think could make a big impact. And so, and then also the code clarification improvements that I mentioned on a previous slide and process improvements. That's where we think that the greatest impact could be made in reaching that objective of increasing additional ADUs in our community. We are recommending delay to future consideration, maybe a future project, the idea of allowing more than one ADU per lot. And I wanted to explain why, because I know that was one of the main directions from the retreat earlier this year. In completing all of these different routes that we went through for this ADU evaluation, we just didn't see a lot of evidence that that was something that was, standing out as a barrier to ADU construction. And so in order to really make the most impact with these code changes and keep them targeted, we thought that those 4 items recommended as a focus would have more of an impact on the number of ADUs in the community. There's also some more complexity and complication that comes up with that item, because we would have to think through whether there would be additional changes to the occupancy restrictions for ADUs, how that would affect parking restrictions. It just brings up a lot more questions than the ones that are recommended as a focus, which are really quite targeted. Also, one of the Housing Advisory Board's recommendations was to eliminate parking requirements for ADUs. That was certainly something that we've seen other cities do recently. I mentioned that there's some variability in those cities we looked at on whether they require parking or not. However, we think that the way that the code is written now requires 1 parking space for an accessory dwelling unit. However, if the owner chooses to do an affordable ADU, they're exempted from that parking requirement. So we do have the option right now for people, if they need to go forward without an additional parking space, as long as it's an affordable ADU. So we think that there's currently an avenue to do that. But the idea of eliminating parking requirements entirely, we believe that that would be a more complex change to make, less of a targeted change, and something that would probably require more robust public engagement. The top 4 items are all things that were kind of discussed in that previous round in 2018. And these would kind of be new conversations. So with those targeted changes, we would recommend a public engagement level of consult and really rely on our existing formal practices, such as the Housing Advisory Board, Planning Board, and the public hearings that would be in place for the ordinance adoption. And that in that way, we could keep it on target to be adopted in the second quarter of 2023. So that's all I have for you tonight on ADUs. We have many more topics to go through. So I'm going to pass it over to Christopher to talk about Boulder Junction Phase 2.
Thanks so much for that, Lisa. Before we move on, I have a question for Brad, and then I see Bob has a question as well.
Okay.
Yeah, your question?
Well, okay, I'll go first, Bob, if that's okay. My question is just, might it be more helpful for us to ask staff the ADU questions now, in that they're very fresh, or are they going to come up again?
We actually thought about that, and we think that it would be better for us to do the full flow, because we're going to find out that there's kind of intersection between some of the topics.
All right. Bob, was that your question as well? All right.
Thank you.
Carry on then. Thanks so much.
We'll go ahead and have Sarah continue now.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and good evening, council members. I'm Sarah Force, a principal planner in the Comprehensive Planning Group, and I'll be doing an overview of the Boulder Junction Phase 2 project. So next slide. So quick reminder, this project is the implementation of the second phase of the Transit Village Area Plan, which was originally adopted in 2007. When we look at the initiation of phase 2, it should be based off of 3 criteria that's been identified already. So the first is to demonstrate phase 1 has been substantially completed. Right now, PNDS staff are currently preparing a phase 1 outcome report, and we're working on that with other departments as well. We should also confirm that there is market support and support for the land uses proposed in the phase 2 area. And then the other criteria is that we should develop a plan for providing infrastructure improvements outlined in the TVAP implementation plan. Next slide. So if you remember at the study session back in September 22nd, City Council was presented with 2 different options for the scope of work for phase 2. The first option was essentially to just implement the plan as it stands today. The second option included an evaluation of the proposed land uses and mobility connections in the phase 2 area to ensure that they're aligned with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, market trends, as well as current community needs. So City Council directed us to move forward with the second option. So that would include a slightly extended project schedule to incorporate a more robust community engagement process to discuss alternatives, to develop a preferred approach, as well as look at kind of the preferred approach for land use and mobility connections, and then to move forward with an adoption of a plan amendment. So council members also reiterated the importance of utilizing the racial equity instrument as part of the process, engaging the community that now lives or works in the phase 1 area to understand what's working as well as what's not working today, and to also evaluate the placemaking and urban design elements in a plan amendment for the phase 2 area. So finally, there was also a request for staff to analyze the scope of work to see if there might be opportunities to phase the project, to gain efficiencies, and to also shorten the general timeframe of certain tasks. Next slide. So to address council's request, staff explored a geographic phasing strategy. So for example, we looked at starting from the area south of Pearl Parkway and then moving to the north. It was found that this approach may not necessarily create efficiencies in the schedule, and it also might lead to repetition of multiple tasks when we move from one area to the next. So instead, we're proposing to consolidate tasks and to sequence the project in a way that distinguishes the planning updates, so tasks 1 through 3, from the implementation steps, tasks 4 and 5. For example, the goal is to reach a meaningful milestone and initiate the adoption process for the plan amendments, as well as updates to the BVCP land use map by late summer 2023. Then implementation steps such as zoning updates, potential expansion of the general improvement districts, and infrastructure phasing, that will then occur once a plan amendment has been adopted. And there also might be some tasks that can overlap with that adoption process as well. So the overall schedule, we're anticipating that both the plan amendment as well as the initial implementation steps, such as zoning updates, will be completed in approximately 18 to 21 months. Next slide. So this project is unique since it now includes a potential plan amendment in addition to implementation of the phase 2 area. So I'll go over a few of the elements of the community engagement approach, but please keep in mind, this does not include specific outreach and engagement for each task. Our communications and engagement plan will provide more detail for that. So in general, we plan to do broad community engagement, especially for understanding lessons learned from phase 1, evaluating potential alternatives for a plan amendment, and then also reaching consensus on a preferred approach for a plan amendment. In general, we also plan to have focus groups that may be engaged throughout the entire project. We anticipate around 4 different types of focus groups, and we want to have 4 different focus groups to ensure diverse representation of community members, and to also have community members who can offer technical expertise, and to also have those that might be stakeholders directly impacted by the project. So the 4 groups that we anticipate are looking at having people that represent daily users, property owners and businesses or business owners, advocacy representatives, as well as developers and design professionals. And then in addition to that, we'll also be engaging representatives from relevant city boards throughout the project. Next slide. So when we think about engagement as a whole for this project, we know we want to be strategic and ensure we are clearly communicating engagement opportunities and how they are aligned with the scope of work. We also want to approach engagement with a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. Using the racial equity instrument throughout the project will help us do that. And we want to make sure engagement is accessible and flexible by providing information that's interesting and offering different ways for people to conveniently participate in the process. So lastly, we want to make sure that we're building in flexibility and to be able to adjust the community engagement approach according to project needs and to look at how we're meeting our engagement goals as well. Next slide. So we look forward to hearing any additional feedback we have that we receive from you on this updated scope of work and schedule. We'll plan on taking this information to Planning Board on November 15th to receive their comments and input before we finalize the scope of work and the community engagement approach. And then lastly, we'll plan to formally kick off the project early next year. So thank you for your time. And now I'll pass it off to Carl.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, council members. I'm Carl Geiler with PNDS. I'm going to talk about other PNDS priority projects that are at various levels of completion and some that are yet to be started. I'm going to talk mostly about the code change items, and then I'll pass it back to our comprehensive planning team. Next slide, please. So council is familiar with the site review criteria update. This is a project that is pretty much coming near the finish line. It's the final component of the community benefit project, which commenced in 2018. We came back to council on August 25th as part of a study session to get some direction on the drafting of the ordinance. We've been revising the ordinance. We now have an updated draft that's now ready for public review. So we're now in the process of reaching out to design professionals and our neighborhood advocates that we've been talking to and architects across town to get their feedback on the latest change. And we're already scheduled to go to Planning Board on December 20th, and we're looking to come back to council in January and February of 2023 on first and second reading. So like I said, this project is nearing completion. Next slide, please. Council is also familiar with the use table and standards project, as we also talked about that on August 25th. This project is also approaching completion. If you look at what we've accomplished from 2018 to now, in 2022, we've been making a lot of progress on phase 2. You'll remember in June, we brought forward Module 1, which was an ordinance to do some simplifications, clarifications, and reorganization of the use tables to make it more usable and understandable. So that was adopted in June. We are now in the process of bringing through an ordinance on Module 2, which is looking at making changes to add more mixed use in the industrial areas of the city, as well as doing some steps of implementation of the East Boulder Subcommunity Plan. So this is scheduled to come to council in December. So the next stage for use tables and standards is Module 3, which is what we talked about on August 25th, which would focus on mixed use and 15-minute neighborhoods, more in a residential context and a neighborhood center context. So we're anticipating that would have an ordinance coming through towards the end of Q2, beginning of Q3. Next slide, please. So the next project, and I know it has a lot of interest among council members and those in the community, is occupancy reform. People will remember that a year ago, pretty much from today, there was the Bedrooms Are for People initiative, which was on the ballot in Boulder. That initiative did not pass, but it was by a close margin. We did some community surveys that showed that there was strong community interest to make changes to occupancy in Boulder to allow more affordable housing options. So that's why it prompted council to ask that staff look at, as part of the retreat, updates to the land use code that might be different than what was proposed on the ballot, but might accomplish it in different ways. So the project did commence in 2022, but as Brad had outlined, there's been some staff reassignments that we've been dealing with that has delayed the project. But we do anticipate coming back to council in the end of the first quarter to bring some of the options that we've seen and also come with a community engagement plan to get council's feedback on that. We have been looking at peer communities and are putting together a document. We're in the middle of the analysis, so we'd like to come back with some recommendations at that time. The goal is to bring an ordinance back to council with targeted changes in the land use code by the end of Q2 or start of Q3. Next slide, please. So another project of interest is what we call the Zoning for Affordable Housing project. This is something that kind of grew out of some projects that weren't able to meet their density goals or affordable housing goals based on some limitations in the zoning code. We were requested by council at the retreat to look at targeted changes to the land use code that would remove some of those zoning barriers. So particularly there's some zones of the city that are anticipated for additional housing as growth areas, like the Boulder Valley Regional Center and some of our neighborhood centers. These tend to be in the BR and BC zones. So these are some zones that have some density limitations that in some senses are kind of suburban. They have 1,200 square feet of open space per dwelling unit or 1,600 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. What we've heard from the development community is because of those lot sizes and the FARs that exist on those sites, it tends to drive a product that is a larger floor plate units rather than smaller, more modest sized units. So we'd be looking at targeted changes that would revise those density limits, maybe even waiving them if there's a certain amount of affordable housing on the site, or maybe just changing them altogether, just so that we can get more of a yield of units on the site so that we get a higher percentage of affordable units out of projects in areas where housing is anticipated. So we're looking again, just like occupancy, to come back to council with potential options at the end of Q1. We would have a draft scope and language at that meeting so that council could say, yes, move forward with this, or change this, or look at this. And then again, the goal is to bring forward an ordinance by the end of Q2, beginning of Q3 to accomplish this change. So with this, that covers our code change things that are on our docket. I'm going to pass it back to Comprehensive Planning, which is Christopher Johnson, to talk about the Area 2 Planning Reserve.
Great. Thank you, Carl. Good evening, City Council. As Carl mentioned, I'm Christopher Johnson. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Senior Manager. There are two additional projects here on the list that we want to discuss this evening. This first one here, the Area 3 Planning Reserve Urban Services Study. If you recall, that was also discussed briefly at the study session on September 22nd, where we did the initial review of the Boulder Junction scope of work. At that meeting, council expressed a desire to go ahead and move ahead with the urban services study in order to ensure that it was completed prior to the next major update to the comprehensive plan. So staff are prepared to proceed with the development of that scope of work for the urban services study early next year. I will note, as a precursor and to really help us refine the approach to this study, staff is ready to move forward immediately with an analysis of the existing development capacity within our current service boundaries. So that would include areas 1 and 2. That capacity analysis will ultimately assist staff with refining that preliminary scope, identifying what consultant tasks are needed, and also estimating our budget needs for the project. And we would anticipate coming back to council in early Q2 of next year to review that capacity analysis and also the preliminary scope of work. And that would serve as an interim milestone for this project to continue to move that forward as expeditiously as we can. Next slide, please. So this last item, while not identified as a priority project per se, city leadership and staff have recognized that there's really an unexpected alignment of multiple planning efforts in a lot of community interest in the downtown area that covers really many different aspects of creating a vibrant, successful community core that includes land use, mobility, parks and public spaces, historic preservation, safety, and economic vitality. This is particularly important as the community continues to emerge from the impacts of COVID and really sets a course for how downtown can continue to serve all of our residents and visitors successfully. We have already initiated work on the Streets as Public Spaces project that's evolved out of the conversations around West Pearl. And as you know, we've already established a process subcommittee with council members Weiner and Benjamin. So that project in particular is moving ahead very rapidly. And we anticipate an immediate sort of interim milestone for that piece of this work is to hold a study session with council in March of next year to review those preliminary recommendations for some spring and summer opportunities to activate certain locations downtown. But looking at this more broadly, there currently is no formalized oversight or project management structure that would ultimately monitor really the full complement of projects and ensure close coordination among the various departments that are involved, of which there are many. And rather than executing each of these projects independently, we would encourage council to consider the need for this larger strategic framework that really facilitates collaboration across all of these projects, in particular due to the synergy of all the project schedules landing at relatively the same time, and really the importance of this work to downtown and really to Boulder as a community as a whole. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brad to walk through some various options for the priorities and sequencing of all of this work.
Thanks, Christopher. Appreciate that. We're going to come back to this slide, so I'm just showing it as a quick snapshot right now. Ultimately, it reflects the same matrix that we provided on page 41 of 92 in your packet. To just orient you, though, very briefly to this is a completion time frame. So while we talked about Area 3, for example, in terms of starting, this would be a completion date. And if there's a blank to the right of the date, that means it would be the same carrying over in these various options. Next slide, please. Option 1 is our recommended series of time frame, as we indicated. You can see that we still achieve a meaningful number of items within this coming year. Really, 3 out of depending on how you wanted to characterize it, 3 out of 4 making meaningful interim steps along the way. That does presume the targeted scope that we talked about for occupancy reform and the very thin sliced elements for zoning for affordable housing that were in line with what the council retreat discussed. And then you can see how this does play out as you go further. I would also point your attention to page 24 of 92 in the overall packet, where these interim steps are identified as one of the columns in a bit more detail. And we do have a slide in our hip pocket if we want to go to that scenario with some of that detail as well. Next slide, please. We've labeled this next option as expansion of the ADU scope, and you can see the elements that would move forward under this general premise and those that would be put on pause. Carl gave a really outstanding overview of where we are already on the use tables and standards, and a clear understanding too of the occupancy reform and where we are in those. But this would contemplate, again, putting that on hold for some period while these other items, which could be described as the recommended scope plus the other items that were identified by Lisa as possibilities. Next slide, please. Option 3 is a reprioritization of the project. So again, reflecting in the more specific matrix that's in the packet, various ways that could be mixed and matched and still maintain meaningful milestones, as we indicated. In this scenario, ADUs would be put on hold. Some of the completion of site review and use tables would be put on hold, and Area 3 would be put on hold. I will note that part of the reason for our recommended, a big part of our recommended one is recognizing that the horse, so to speak, is really out the barn door already on site review and use tables. The amount of resources and additional time on the back end later to lasso the horse, bring it back in and close the barn door, and then reopen it a year later really does represent some inefficiencies in terms of our staff use of our staff resources. Next slide, please. So this is a return to the overall matrix of summary. We positioned it this way not to imagine that these are the only iterations, and we understand and welcome a full conversation around this, but just to give some operating order to the discussion this evening. Again, you can see that in the recommended option 1 with the scope that we described in our presentation, being able to get many of these items done in 2023, not shown on this slide, but the interim conditions for some of the others as well. And then the trade-offs that come with a heavy emphasis on all aspects of ADUs, or a complete pause on some of those items that are already well underway in many cases, but giving complete emphasis on some of these other items further down the list. Briefly on the next slide, if I may, these are the questions we presented at the beginning. Upon reflection, I suspect we'll, of course, have discussion around this. It may be easiest upon reflection to answer number 2, and I can imagine council answering number 1 and 3 kind of in tandem. But of course, we'll follow council's lead in that regard. If we could go back one slide and maybe have that as a reference slide for the discussion. That completes our presentation at this time. Councilmember Friend, Mayor Pro Tem Fenn, and happy to answer your questions.
Thanks so much, Brad, and everyone else who contributed to that presentation. So first we'll start with questions that we have for staff to clarify, and then we will go into discussion and answering staff's questions. So questions, I see Junie, then Bob, then Tara. Junie, you're up. But you are still muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Thanks. I have a question on saturation. So I have 2 questions. I mean, I noticed in the memo you mentioned how long Boulder we've been doing ADUs almost before I was born. But my question is whether it matters if the property is in a flood zone, which a lot of Boulder is. So whether removing the saturation limit for ADUs will cause any type of safety concerns in the future.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the saturation limit and the flood regulations would not be tied in any way. So changing the saturation limit wouldn't have any impact necessarily. The flood regulations and restrictions that ensure safety would remain regardless of the saturation limit.
Okay, thank you for that. And then I have another question about or maybe that sounds more like a comment. I've had the opportunity to, when I was delivering a lot of literature for voting this election, I ended up going to a lot of the neighborhoods, walking around, especially in the Cosgrove area. I was very surprised to see some of the sizes of the ADUs. They are really large homes, which was very, very surprising to me. And then I think part of it too, it was hard for me to find the ADU. I would be walking around trying to find the address. It was hard to find. So that was one thing that I find challenging with that. But my question is, I suppose it's not one or the other, but I'm wondering, instead of limiting or removing the saturation limits, what is your department doing in allowing more duplexes and triplexes instead of creating these ADUs, which I was very surprised, as I mentioned to you, the sizes. And yeah, I was just surprised by that when I was walking around that neighborhood. And I heard from a few community members on some of the challenges of having these ADUs in these neighborhoods.
Councilmember Joseph, maybe I can take a first stab at it and then hand it off to Lisa and Carl. I think this gets to the bigger question of adding by right units on individual lots. We would really see that under the category of zoning for affordability expanded. So beyond the scope that we presented this evening, it's a very good question, and thanks for asking that. It does get into issues of carrying capacity of the infrastructure, existing property rights, a relationship to the comprehensive plan and items like that. So with that kind of umbrella concept, do Lisa or Carl, either one of you pick it up and elaborate?
Yeah, I can talk about it. Some council members might remember the large homes and lots project, which kind of went down that same road of exploring whether areas that typically don't have duplexes or triplexes we could introduce those into those areas. We did come forward with an ordinance to make some changes, but it does present some challenges when it comes to consistency with with the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. There are land use designations that have specific density limits. So in order for us to change the zoning, like the land use would have to change to support that. So we found that, adding duplexes and triplexes in certain areas of town, they would have to have very large lot sizes to even have those types of housing types. Unless the zoning were changed in the land use before that. And like Brad said, there were some infrastructural things that came up in that analysis as well. I mean, areas that are typically more rural residential or residential estate in character were built with infrastructure meant to support single family homes. There'd have to be some sort of analysis in upzoning those areas, whether the infrastructure is available or sufficient to support that additional density. So this is something that we looked at it in quite a bit of depth back in 2018 and 2019.
Thank you for that. I have one last question, Rachel. Thank you. And this is more on the line of having conversation with community as well. And that's one question, because we're talking about ADUs, and we're talking about access to more affordable units, housing units. And my question, how do you ensure that ADU is being used for affordable housing? Is there a process, or do we just go on the, what's the word? We just hope that, once it's created, that this person will just do the right thing and rent it for affordable housing?
We do have representatives from HHS here, and I believe, and I'm going out on a limb, this is a new question for me, but I believe that those deed restricted are subject to the same program that we do for others, but I will defer to HHS or other staff.
I can start off, and maybe Kurt can add more from HHS, but when we approve a affordable ADU, that goes into a legal document called the Declaration of Use that's recorded with the property. And so they sign something that says, I'm keeping this at the affordable limit. Every year, the city sets the maximum rent table for affordable ADUs. So I think a one bedroom's about $1,600, I think, if I remember correctly, right now for this year. And so they are swearing to keep it at that. And then there are some code language, which Kurt can help me with, that provides for penalties if they do not abide by that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. This is good to hear, that there's a process, whether that's upheld, that's different. I have heard, or at least from my conversation with community, where ADUs are created and the owner of the property moved into the ADU and then rent their main housing. So again, that takes that ADU out of the market. Although it seems that we've created affordable housing for other people to move into, but not necessarily. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Junie, Bob, and Tara.
Well, thanks, Junie. That was a nice tie up to some questions I had. I want to talk about ADUs as well. So Lisa, let's continue that thread that you started to go down with the declaration of use. I remember, and Aaron will remember this too, from 2018 when we put this all together and liberalized the ADU rules, that we really have two flavors of ADUs, right? We have regular or market rate ADUs where the owner can charge whatever they want, whatever the market will bear. And then we have the separate type, which I think we're calling affordable ADUs with the declaration of use. Is that right, Lisa?
Yep, that's correct.
Great. And as you flashed up on a slide really quick, but I want to make sure that I got this right. For the affordable ADUs, the ones where there's a declaration of use and the owner is swearing that they're keeping the rents below a certain level, I think that level is that which would be affordable to somebody who makes at or less than 75% of the area median income. Do I have that right?
Yep, that's correct.
Great. And the reason that, or the trade-off, I'll say, because rent control, of course, is not allowed in Colorado, and so we have to kind of contractually get to it, which sounds like we're doing. And I think I saw on your slide that about a third of the 200 ADUs that have been created since we liberalized the rules 4 years ago, about a third of them, or a third of the owners opted for this affordable ADU, and then 2/3 went with market rate. Is that right, roughly?
Yep, about 70 went with affordable and about 130 went with market rate.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Good. And so the quid pro quo then that we do with a property owner in order to entice them to sign this declaration of use and swear that they're only going to charge rent up to the 75% AMI level is, I think we give them a couple of graces or a couple of opportunities. One is we don't require off-street parking. Is that right, for the affordable AUs?
Correct.
And the other, I think there's maybe a size differential. I think we let them build a little bit bigger too. Is that right?
Yep. For detached ADUs, the typical limit for market rate is 550 square feet. For affordable, it's 800 square feet. Mm-hmm. And for attached, it's a difference of a third of the structure and a half of the structure.
Right. So it sounds like that enticement's kind of working if a third of the people are kind of opting. Some of them may have to because maybe they can't provide parking, but it sounds like that enticement's kind of working. I remember back in 2018, we put this together and we had no idea if anyone would go down the affordable route and we might just get crickets, but it sounds like at least a third of the 200 are going down the affordable path. Is that right?
Yeah, I agree with that characterization. We also asked that question in the survey of ADU owners to try to understand why. And that's what I was saying. 40% said they did it to reduce the parking requirement. The next most common, though, was 34% said that they were doing it just to provide affordable housing. So,
which is just absolutely great. And I really appreciate people doing that to meet this need. So I understand that we have kind of a little bit of a fork in the road here on the scope of the ADU work. One would be kind of focused on those areas that staff had recommended, and the other would be an expanded scope, which I think was your option 2, which could include parking and size and so on and so forth, but that would take longer, understandably. If we were to eliminate parking for all ADUs, the parking requirement for all ADUs, and had both market rate and affordable ADUs have the same size requirements, what would be the reason, other than maybe the goodness of someone's heart, why they would go down, do the declaration of use and commit to keep the rents below a certain level? I mean, wouldn't that kind of take away one of the incentive to do that?
Correct. Without the incentive to reduce if the parking requirement is 0, there is no incentive to reduce the parking requirement, which is something that we're seeing with the affordable ADUs currently.
Right. So we might get more ADUs, but we would get maybe less or fewer affordable ADUs.
Technically affordable, yes. And one other part of the survey that we implemented was asking what the rents are that people are charging. And we're finding that even the market rate rents are, under that affordable limit too. So that's an interesting conclusion that we came to as well from the survey.
Yeah. And have you guys tried to forecast out a few years to see what the trends might be? In other words, if some of the market rate ones are actually currently just, they're affordable, but there's no, as Junie pointed out, there's no guarantee that they would be affordable in the future. If the market kind of rises, they could charge whatever they wanted to if they didn't have this declaration of use. Is that right?
Correct. There'd be less assurance there.
Okay, good. That's helpful, Lisa. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to colloquy on that, if I may, Tara. Just, I'd like to use that word with you. So just following up on Bob's question, it made me wonder if we were to remove the parking minimums and make units larger for ADUs, such that, say, one that's affordable now because it has the larger amount and fewer parking, would they then legacy out of that program, or would they like, could they start then renting for non-affordable? Have we thought about that? Does my question make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I don't think we've thought about the logistics of that. They do have a signed declaration of use that says that they have to remain at those limits. So we'd have to connect with our city attorney's office and see what would happen if changes affected that.
Okay, like if we just made it, you know, by right, not part of the affordable program, you know, 1,200 and 1 or 0 parking spots, I think we would have to maybe, I'd be very curious to know at a future update what the impacts are, what we could maybe offer if people, you would hate to see somebody get locked into something, you know, that was a previous incarnation that's now easier under future rules. And so, yeah, I'd just be curious what staff can do there. Thanks. Tara.
So I have 2 questions about ADUs and then one about the options, but it sounds like we're just talking about ADUs. Do you think I should leave my option question for later?
I think let's just do the ADUs for now. Makes some sense.
Okay, Rachel. So my first question is going to be, we had some very interesting letters from the neighborhood associations, particularly one from Martin Acres. So tell me, is it possible to exempt certain neighborhoods, perhaps from I think saturation limits, I agree that they should be removed, but I am worried also about the neighborhoods that are adjacent to CU, East Aurora and Goss Grove, where, you know, as Junie said, the houses are way smaller and closer together. Also, Martin Acres is like that, really small houses and smaller lots. And also, of course, the hill. So is there a possibility for some type of exemption? And if we change some of the ADU requirements in some areas, do we have to do one size fits all for all of the neighborhoods?
That's a great question. We certainly do not have to do it applying exactly the same across the whole city. That I would caution that would create a lot of inefficiencies and confusion for property owners, and in many ways would just replicate the issues that we already have with the saturation limits of people not understanding if they're in the right area. We also have many features of the land use code that differ based on lot size or things like that, and make sure that development nearby is compatible. And so we have a lot of assurances that would mitigate any of those potential impacts and also be kind of tailored to whatever the specific characteristics of those lots within those neighborhoods might be.
Okay. And the second question I think some community members might ask is, there was notes in our packet about height modifications. Can you go into the details of what exactly that means?
Yeah, so it's actually, we've had a couple recent applications where somebody is attempting to put an ADU in an existing structure. So the structure is already there, but it happens to be over 25 feet, which is our height limit. And there's not currently a variance option that would allow you to modify past 25 feet. So in the interest of balancing, you know, adaptive reuse of an existing structure, often if it's an existing structure, it's going to have less of an impact on neighbors because it's already been there. And we do have variance options and an established public process for something like that. So just providing that option to allow for height modifications for existing structures is something that was raised.
So it wouldn't be for any new structures?
No, it would be limited to just providing that flexibility for existing structures.
Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Kara, I'm changing my mind. Please ask all your questions.
Well, the other one has to do with the Civic Center, which just has nothing to do with this conversation. So I'm not going to ask that last question. I don't think it should.
These are staff questions. This is your moment for staff questions. I think.
All right. Well, you had
at
option 1, option 2, and option 3, which sounded like when we used to go eat in a Chinese restaurant very long time ago, back in the day, and we picked from different menus. But are those menus that you gave us, we have to use one of those 3? For instance, I am particularly interested in the civic area because so many things are happening right now. You know, to do everything at the same time, besides being consistent and organized and having economies of scale, I didn't see that in all of the different options. Is there a possible way to do ADUs and also do the civic area downtown in the Q3 sooner rather than later? So can we pick and choose from these menus? Or how can we, let's say, how can we do whatever we're going to do and also prioritize the Civic Center just because we're doing the hotel and we're doing so many other things at once? So it would seem like the greatest thing in the world, and plus the pedestrianization, and we're talking about West Pearl. So wouldn't it make the most sense to do all that at the same time and just have a grand plan as opposed to ad hoc?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Councilmember Weiner. And to your first basic question of do you have to pick one of these three? Absolutely not. Mixing and matching, using this as kind of the buffet and picking bits and pieces, but we did want to at least frame up the issues and help try to explain the trade-offs. We can iterate on that. And so to your specific question of, could we do the civic area downtown, which is really a whole group of different projects earlier than what it's set for, which is really just ad hoc right now in terms of doing that. One scenario, as we have there in option 3, would be to start that in Q3 and put a fine date on it a year and a half from now. Another would be to do it immediately, but then other things would need to drop off, and we'd have to talk about which of those to do, or have a complete ramp up to some additional resources for that. That would just in practical terms probably take 3 to 6 months. The reason we put it in this whole mix of discussion, because it is a little bit of the outlier from the others, is because it just is an emerging set of issues that comes forward. But this one, as you note from the first option column, really is on no time frame at this point. I don't know if that helps answer your question or makes it more complicated.
More complicated, but that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Over to Councilmember Wallach.
No, I thought Lauren was first.
I don't know. The hands on my screen show Mark, then Lauren.
Okay.
Lauren, would you like to go? Sounds like you've been promoted.
Either way, I appreciate it, Mark. I did take my hand down and then put it back up again, so I'm causing chaos over here, like always. Let's see, I guess I'd be happy to go for it. So first, I want to check in, like Carl, you're doing plans reviews and heading up 3 different sections here. Do we have positions approved to help you? I feel I'm concerned. This seems like a lot.
Yeah, we appreciate that. And Carl, please do speak for yourself, and maybe Charles, you can chime in as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And I too am very concerned for Carl, and so I appreciate that. We're in the throes of filling some key positions right now. We've made some key hires very recently that are going to start taking some of these pressures off of our staff that are kind of doing dual duty right now. So help is on the way.
Great. Thank you. Then I have a couple questions about, so you kind of clarified right now that the civic area, to get it to not just be ad hoc, we would have to prioritize it. Right now, it's sort of not considered to have someone overseeing all of it in a comprehensive way. Is that?
Yes, deciding now is probably a matter of discussion, and you do have the check-in a month or 2 later as well. Right now, the component parts of that we listed, only a couple of them are on any kind of start time frame. The rest of them are all ad hoc. So it's a bigger discussion about whether council wants to find a way to prioritize all of those and find a way to kind of get them ramped up in a similar starting manner for an umbrella kind of approach. But that really is a little bit of an outlier on the side.
Okay. And somewhat related to that, I mean, we have different kinds of planners who take on different kinds of projects. Could you kind of, overview, like the grouping, like which ones of these items are really sort of using the same staff, the same sort of group of staff?
Sure, I'd be happy to do. And the rest of the staff, please chime in, Charles and KJ. Just going down the list that's on the screen right now from the matrix, ADU is handled by our policy group and developer review, Boulder Junction by comprehensive planning, site review by the policy group, use table by policy group, occupancy reform by the policy group, zoning for affordability is the policy group. Area 3 is part of comprehensive planning, and civic area is really hard to characterize because it's involving transportation and parks and others, but would be most heavily involved by the comprehensive planning group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I also wanted to touch on a couple of questions I had that kind of came up around land use and the comprehensive plan. You guys referenced that large lot study, but it seems like not all, because it's sort of related to Junie's question about duplexes or additional units versus ADUs. And I just wanted to kind of get a little bit more clarity there. So the large lots are in our lowest density zone, right, under our comprehensive sort of number of dwelling units per acre. Other residential zones, so they only allow 2 units per acre, and other, like RL1, which is our largest land use area, allows up to 6 dwelling units per acre. Is it possible that we might be able to make some change? And my understanding is also that the comprehensive plan wants these restrictions are applied holistically and not on a per lot basis. And so I just wanted to clarify that there might be some flexibility for doing duplexes or something like that potentially in some zones, but maybe not all zones. Is that a fair assessment?
Carl, do you want to speak to this, or?
Sure, go ahead.
Good, no, please go ahead.
I mean, in terms of housing types, that's relatively easy to make a change in the land use code. To put a good comparison, they allow 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre, but they do it differently. The RL1 zone only permits single family homes and has a minimum lot area. And RL2 allows all different types of housing types, but uses open space. So in RL2 zones, you'll actually see little apartment buildings or duplexes, triplexes, even though it's low density. But even though their unit types are different, the density is still the same as RL1. It's when you start introducing those housing types and adding units that go above the 6 dwelling units per acre that it then begs to changing the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan.
So right now, if we were to look at RL1 as a whole within our community, are you saying that we are close to hitting more than 6 units per acre in all of our RL1 zoning, or would be if we allowed additional units?
I think a lot of the city is very close. If a lot of those subdivisions that were done in the 70s in the RL1 zones maxed out that 6 dwelling units per acre. Not saying everywhere in the city, but I'd say most of those developments maxed it out.
Okay. Good to know. The other question I had related to that was you were talking about utilities and utility capacity. And I was just curious because a lot of other communities have done, made these kinds of changes, and I haven't heard a lot around, Minneapolis having significant issues with their utility capacity. And so I was just wondering, is this something that other communities were just extra prepared for, or how is it that other communities are able to manage kind of making some of these changes with their existing utility infrastructure? Or is this a problem that I'm just unaware of?
I mean, I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I mean, obviously, we consulted with our own, engineering and public works staff, and they know the utilities that exist throughout the city. They know the areas where it might have capacity and other areas that don't. I can't really speak for other communities, whether they did that analysis at all, but it's something that we have to defer to our engineering staff on.
Okay, thank you.
Lauren, do you mind if I colloquy on the large lots question?
Please.
So Carl, it piques my curiosity too. And you may recall we overlapped. I was in like a work group, and you and Phil Kleisler were like in the
all these memories are flying back at me,
I'd forgotten all about large lots until today. But my question is, as I recall, in 2018 and 2019, we got all the way up. I mean, I wasn't on council at the time, but as a city, we got all the way up to a first reading. Like there was a packet with a proposed ordinance, and there was a ton of community engagement. So, and I think the proposal was maybe for duplexing in RE and RL1 and RL2. Is that? Or... No,
it was actually. It was focused on RR and RE.
RR, that's what I meant. Yep. And RE, right? It
Correct.
It was the... Okay, sorry, my computer just blanked there for a minute. So anyhow, when we got there, like to Lauren's point of carrying capacities and changes, how did we handle that? Is it a different conversation because it was the RR and RE and those didn't have the issues that we're talking about other places?
The thing about the ordinance that was brought forward is it didn't require a Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan change because the change still was consistent with the underlying land use. So it proposed to change the code to allow duplexes and triplexes, but it did still require the lot area necessary to achieve those units. So on a 15,000 square foot RE lot, if they wanted to do a duplex, they'd have to have 30,000 square feet of lot area. So we also, but one thing we did propose as an alternative was that because the RE zone is the same land use designation as RL1 and RL2, which allows 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre, council could have advised to change the ordinance to allow basically a doubling of the density in RE without changing the land use designation.
Okay.
That didn't move forward, obviously.
Right. Is it your recollection though that the 20 in September, right before an election in 2019, that council said something like, let the next council pick it up because we're about to change guard? Is that? I mean, it didn't get voted on and rejected, right? It just got punted.
Yeah, it didn't pass first reading. I can't recall whether or not they said the next council should take it up or not. I don't recall.
That's okay. Thanks. Thanks, Lauren, for letting me cut. Do you have more questions? Okay, over to Mark.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of jump around out of order. You had referenced a Plan 1 outcome report with respect to Boulder Junction. When are we likely to see that?
Hi, thank you for that question. So you'll likely see that report in Q1 of 2023. So kind of around the same time that we're going to kick off the project.
And what will it be looking at?
So the substantial completion report is pretty much like an analysis of looking at what did the Transit Village Area Plan recommend, and now that it's been 15 years later and we've had developments and it's kind of reaching completion, what is actually implemented today? So it'll do a little bit of a comparison of what's in the plan and what was the actual outcome today, and provide that information as well.
Will there be any analysis of what we think has worked well versus what we think has not worked well? Will there be any critical analysis of the outcomes themselves?
Yes, I think with the substantial completion report, our team talked about this a little bit. It might be a little bit more factual of what's there today, but the phase 2 project, Boulder Junction phase 2, would start with that conversation of it, kind of beginning community engagement with that conversation of what's working well or not in phase 1, and use that to kind of inform a potential plan amendment and the implementation strategy as well.
Okay, thanks. My next question is with respect to the civic area. How does the civic area master plan phase 2 implementation differ from the Pearl Street 50-year refresh? Where do they overlap or not overlap?
Christopher, do you want to take that one? I can speak to it as well.
I'm certainly happy to take a stab at that. And I don't know if Allie Rhodes is still on the call or not, but that would be wonderful if she's available to chime in. But as I understand, the civic area master plan phase 2 implementation is specific to the park itself in the area around the band shell, the atrium building, the east bookend, and that sort of area. The Pearl Street refresh is, as you would expect, is specifically focused on Pearl Street itself.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm going to jump to ADUs. Do we track ADUs by neighborhood? When CU adjacent neighborhoods come to us and say, please be cautious of what you're doing in our neighborhood because it's going to have an adverse impact. Do we have the data that says you might be right, or you're off base? You're not suffering a disparate impact.
We do actually track and map every approved ADU, so we would be able to do that analysis pretty quickly.
I looked at the map, but it's the quantification that's eluding me. I can't just pick all the dots.
Yeah, understood. We could definitely do that.
Okay, that would be very helpful. And I noticed in looking at the map that there was a almost no ADUs between Arapahoe and J Road east of 28th. Is there a particular reason for that? I mean, is it? It just struck me.
Yeah, I would need to look at what the zoning is out there, but there are some neighborhoods where ADUs would be allowed, but they have HOA covenants that don't allow ADUs. So there's some kind of quirks of areas that you might not see a lot of ADUs, but it might not be a city reason.
Okay. And one of the complaints we got on ADUs from neighborhood letters was to caution us about the transformation of neighborhoods from residential neighborhoods to investor-owned neighborhoods exclusively. And are we looking at that in terms of how we're approaching the ADU issue and where ADUs are going to be sprouting up? And obviously, the 4 CU adjacent neighborhoods are probably the ones that come most to mind. You've got the Hill, which is now becoming largely investor-owned anyway.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the main features of our current ADU regulations is the requirement for owner occupancy. So an owner has to live on site in order to have an ADU. And we do confirm that when the ADU is applied for, and as well when the rental license is applied for. There are some clarifications that would be helpful in the code language. I know there's been some issues raised with people that have maybe LLCs that own the property. So there's opportunities to clarify that. However, the owner occupancy requirement, we're pretty confident ensures that there's an owner living on all of these sites and it's not an investor property.
Thank you. And my last question is with respect to occupancy limits, which I think we're due for that conversation and we ought to have it. But for staff, to what extent are your deliberations informed by the fact that we had a referendum on occupancy just last year and the community was not supportive? It doesn't mean you can't have changes to occupancy limits, but I would think that you would be keeping that in mind as you move forward. Is that not the case?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and I'll ask Carl and Charles to maybe jump in as well, but I would say we're very mindful of that vote and respectful of it. We do find it interesting that some of the feedback in surveying still points towards an interest around that. And ultimately, just based on council inquiry over the last year and such, we know that that's a topic that you all would like to explore more.
No, I don't dispute that.
What's that?
Again, I don't dispute that. I'm just saying that you're correct. 47% of the people voted in favor of changing occupancy limits, but 53% did not. And it doesn't mean you can't have changes to occupancy limits. It just means that there ought to be some, I think, some level of caution about how you do it.
Yeah. Yeah, we understand.
Okay, and those are all my questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mark. We will move into discussion, but if no one else has questions, I will ask just a couple. So back to maybe Carl on the large lots, which has piqued my interest today. If we wanted to move forward with some of the large lots work that came so close to the finish line, and that is in keeping with some of the missing middle stuff that we're talking about, would we move into like a consult stage of engagement, or like how could we pick that up where we left it off and dust it off? What would that look like?
Well, I think again, we'd have to see, what exactly the scope of the project would be and where the changes would occur and who we would need to reach out to. I think consult, probably makes sense if we're not going in a drastically different direction, but it has been, 3 years, things have changed, or people might have different opinions, or people might have moved or moved in, so we'd have to, spark up the outreach again. Obviously, this is kind of a new factor being put on to the work program. So we'd have to also look at other code change projects and what would have to slow down or stop if we were to do something like that.
Okay, but if we were to take not expand it at all, but contract it, just, say only, X, Y, or Z portion of this code that was brought up is interesting to this council, or makes sense because it was so thoroughly worked over 3 years ago. Is that a feasible thing that we could, we have an ordinance that's already done?
I mean, it certainly makes it, a little bit easier for us to pick it up again. I think, we've already spent a lot of time drafting an ordinance, and looking at the code. We would have some of those changes already ready. We might still have to, tweak them for a while and think about any unintended consequences. And but it certainly would be easier now that some of that work has been done.
Okay, thanks for that, Tara.
Just a real quick question, and Brad and everyone, you're so wonderful, but I'm going to ask you to speak in East Coast, not Midwest language. So when you say we've done 80%, are you saying we don't care if you switch it around, or are you saying it would really aggravate us? Can you really be? So you had a few different things where you said we've done almost everything, but if you want us to switch, we'll switch. How should we read that? Would you rather not switch? Do you not really care?
I will do my best to remember my time in school in New York to answer. For the site criteria and the use table in particular, we are very far out in towards the finish line on that. It would very much be our preference to get that done because of the loss of efficiency that we would have in needing to pick that up 6 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road. We also do have citizen groups and boards and such that are teed up and engaged. So we would lose a lot of momentum on that. For the other things, as we demonstrated in the one memo matrix, and maybe Lisa or whoever has the slides can get that hip pocket slide that we have with that shown prepared. For the other ones, there would be the trade-off. So I appreciate Carl's answer, for example, regarding reviving the large lot ordinance. Based on what I've learned very recently, I agree that that would be a fairly surgical thing, but I think what he's alluding to is we would still have to prepare that, we would still have to vet it at some minimum level, and there would there would need to be a trade-off then on, call it 3 months of timing on one of the other items on here. This slide is really just an expanded version of what was in your memo as well, but really highlighting those interim milestones with the recommendation, which again, we're happy to deviate from, but it's probably this finer grained level of detail then that we would need to talk about kind of trading out work efforts. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, I think that we go into discussion now, and what I would propose, if we are okay with it, is discussing just staff question number 1 first on ADUs. Is that, like, I think we're going to get to the ADU discussion. Is that kind of thumbs up on that as a, right? Okay, Lauren, was your hand up on ADUs? Okay. So the question from staff, and then we'll welcome any discussion on it, is does council approve of staff's proposed scope and engagement level for the updates to ADU project, or have any questions about the evaluation? So we'd love to hear.
You probably gathered from my question some trepidation about going down the path of waiving parking for all ADUs, because I'm afraid we would lose the affordability declaration that we talked about. That could be done in a phase 2, as Lauren suggested in her hotline, 6 months or a year from now.
Some degree of examination as to whether we will lose the affordability component if we simply make all ADUs the same. And I would hope we would consider seriously keeping some distinction in size and parking requirements between affordable ADUs and regular ADUs. Getting a third of the ADUs to be affordable is better than we get in almost any real estate development project in town, and I'd like to keep that going. So, but yes, I think the scope is very, very appropriate.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren?
Thanks. Let's see. I similarly support the scope that staff has laid out. I would like to make the argument for doing a phase 2 or keeping a phase 2 kind of on the books or in the plans for the future, just because I think that a lot of the work staff has done and that we've heard from boards and commissions has been really valuable feedback. And I think that keeping in mind sort of what these next steps might be and having that on the back burner ready for if the next council decides to take that up. I know that that's something that I will still be hopefully on council in several years and something that I would be interested in. So just making sure that that is not, that we're not losing track of those items as well.
Don't go anywhere, Lauren Folkerts. Okay, Aaron?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with my colleagues and just add a little bit more. So I think you are on the right track. I appreciate the analysis that you did about what you thought would be the most impactful, kind of the most implementable and impactful. And I thought that was really compelling. So you got my buy-in because I thought the analysis was really good, even though it didn't include one of the options that I put in the list originally. But you made great arguments there. And then I'll just agree with Lauren about that phase 2. Keeping that on the books as well. I may well not be on that council, but I think it's a great idea to keep it there. But to not, I thought you had a good set of things, but also Lauren suggested some additional things that are, I think, worthy of consideration. So I don't think we should talk about exactly what that phase 2 should consist of, but just to make the point that it's probably worth, once future council gets to it, sort of checking in on what the scope of that would be, because you might want to open the funnel out a little bit wider for a bigger initiative when if that comes. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Aaron. Tara, then I'll go.
I agree with what everybody said, so I'm going to move on to the civic area, and I'm just going to ask that we remain nimble, because is a different department. As Lauren brought out, there are different parts of the planning department, which she knew, but I didn't know. So being that the civic area is different than what was the process committee, I believe, I'm hoping that we can be ready and prepared should parks and community vitality and the other departments be ready to go with the civic center, and especially in light of the hotel, that we are also nimble and ready and able to move if and when we can combine and do a grand plan versus ad hoc.
Terry, you're not going to like it, but this is really only ADU question right now. So
what?
We're just on question 1.
You can tell
I bet staff took that in, so we'll reincorporate it. We're going to pick that back up on number 3.
I'm so focused. I'm sorry.
we know where your head's at. On ADUs, I agree with all of my colleagues. I do wonder, is there anything that HAB recommended that we haven't captured in either this first sweep or in Lauren's proposed, like phase 2? Because they had, I liked all of their recommendations, and I didn't know if any of those are easy to sweep into phase 1, or are they all phase 2, and were any of them things that staff disagreed with or this council disagreed with? So that's feedback and a question.
Yeah, I can answer that question. So for the most part, the Housing Advisory Board recommendations are very similar to what the staff recommended scope is. I think the 2 deviations are eliminating the parking requirement, which we're recommending for a later study. And they also recommended, this wouldn't really be a code change, but implementing some pre-approved plans for ADUs. So that could be something that could be a future study as well.
Okay, and is that in the, like, are we sort of greenlighting Lauren's future study list here? And was that on that list? I'm sorry, there's just been a lot of different things coming in. I haven't tracked all.
Maybe just to clarify, I think Lauren's list really spoke to a number of zoning changes, which we would put in the category of zoning for affordable housing. A couple of them were related to ADUs, as Lisa indicated. But I think maybe some of the other ones that you're alluding to are more in that bucket.
Well, yeah, I guess I just want to make sure that we all think we're putting the same things in the same buckets before we move on. So, I don't have like a really good side-by-side analysis of what Steph's saying are the 3 things we're gonna get done, or however many it is right now, and then phase 2, and then Lauren's phase 1, 2 list, and then HAB's.
Yeah, Lisa, why don't you bring up that slide that essentially had the 2, and we can review that. I think the second column on that does include a few of the things that you indicated, Lauren, but then the other ones, again, are part of this zoning changes for affordability. I think maybe one's left. Oh, there it is, yeah.
Lauren, anything on your list? And Aaron, I'm not trying to skip you, but just so we make sure that lists are kind of good here. Lauren, is there anything on your list that's not on this slide?
Yeah, so let's see. So the delaying for the future consideration, the minimum parking, which you talked about being on HAB's list. I also had the creating pre-approved designs on my list. I had some extra things like potentially looking at allowing separate ownership of ADUs, and potentially looking at more than 1 ADU per parcel, along with some of the zoning or some of the other code cleanups. But I think those code cleanups staff is all considering those as part of the recommended scope.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to Aaron. Could we leave that slide up though for the rest of this part?
Yeah. So Rachel and I tried to address your question in my comments to say that I liked the phase 2 idea. I thought Lauren had great ideas that should be penciled in for that phase 2 potentially, but that we should also not be setting the phase 2 list in stone right now, but determine it like at the time that we got to that project. So that was just I think that got to what you were saying, but.
I appreciate that. I guess I just didn't want the ideas that were in here to get lost. So as we have a list I agree, we shouldn't set it in stone, but we should also
carry it
add
forward
to this list so that the next council knows what all we considered and thought was worthy of future consideration. So it seems like in the delay to future consideration, maybe the pre-approved models and separate ownership would be the two things to add.
That sounds correct.
Okay. Anybody disagree with that? And then Junie, I see your hand up. Everybody good with that? The focus on for now 4, and then 4 other ones. Junie? Was that a hand?
Sure, thank you, Rachel. I was gonna just say, yes, I support the general direction of staff. The only thing is with the removal of the saturation limits is to ensure robust community participation, because I can imagine some communities will just not, well, they will have some strong reaction to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Junie. Okay, Nicole?
Yeah, just kind of a quick follow-up to that. I think one of the things, Lauren, you had suggested in your hotline post was what the level of engagement is that we're thinking about for this initial one, because a lot of this stuff has had a lot of engagement to date. We have some nice data that staff presented to us. Staff has been in touch with ADU owners. And so I'm curious about if we need to start at consult and kind of what our guidance is for staff in terms of how we're proceeding with engagement, because I thought Lauren's points and hotline were really good about how to potentially expedite that a little bit.
Is that maybe a question for Brad?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, consult is kind of the second tier of engagement. And Lisa, I know you've had conversations with communications, and there may be even some staff from communications here to speak to that. We could characterize that a little bit, but we understand and agree that there's been a good amount of engagement, both structured and unstructured, if you will, or organic in the years leading up to this. Lisa, do you have anything to add?
No, just to say that the idea with the consult is that we would use our established boards and commissions process and, of course, the adoption process through City Council. And that would be kind of the way that we would be obtaining feedback. And that's the way that we would be able to complete this by the second quarter of next year.
Thanks for clarifying.
Thanks, Nicole. Tara, then Lauren.
Sorry, I'm speaking so much. In light of what Junie said, I'm thinking about what Junie said in terms of the community, have we had community engagement on saturation?
We did. So as I mentioned, the saturation limit was increased from 10% to 20% in those 2018 changes. So these were questions that we asked at that time as well. So we are thinking that we can look back at that engagement that was done, 4 years ago, and then supplement with the additional, ADU surveys that we've done this year, the evaluation of those changes, and then this consult level of engagement through the board and commission process this year.
I'm not saying I'm against saturation, but I am saying that there's a big difference between 20% saturation and no saturation. So my question is did you ask people about no saturation? Do you think it's appropriate, or do you not even think we need to do that?
I'd have to look back on exactly how the questions and engagement was framed back in 2018, but I believe it was more open-ended than just, are you okay with 10 to 20%? Great. I think it was a more open-ended conversation, but I will confirm with that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And Lisa, just I'll go to you next, Lauren, but clarify that that's the thing that no other city has, right? Like, we're the only city in the country that has a saturation limit.
I've been trying my hardest to find another one, and I can't.
Helpful factoid. Lauren.
To be clear, I'm not against saturation. I mean, yeah, I'm not against lifting saturation. Just to be clear.
Lauren.
I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to, my favorite board, not that there are favorites, but Design Advisory Board, I noticed is not making it onto some of the lists of boards and commissions that we're checking in with. And it feels like particularly on some of these, it would be appropriate.
Fabulous point. Thank you. Nicole?
Sorry, I forgot one more thing I was going to mention that I really loved about Lauren's hotline post was the idea of scheduling kind of a regular or scheduling a check-in some ways out in the future as well, so that future council can take a look at the changes that were made and have kind of a similar analysis to what you all gave us tonight, just so that we have that scheduled in, because it feels like that's something that may also help the community understand that we're not just going to try to change something and then walk away from it, but that we will be looking at this, tracking some data and coming back to it at some distance out in the future. So I just like the idea of building some of that in as well.
Thanks, Brad.
Just to understand the scope of that, so we're on the same page. So that would be after a couple years of allowing construction and such. Thank you.
All right, staff, do you feel like you have what you need on ADUs?
I do, thank you.
We do, thank you.
Awesome, thanks for that discussion. Okay, so I would propose that maybe we jump to question 3 first, because you know, how we prioritize might impact how we answer Boulder Junction phase 2. Is everybody okay with going to question 3 first? I'm open to being rejected there. Bob?
I'm reading question 3, so I'm not sure if I understand it. I wanted to colloquy on Tara's point on downtown plan. Would question 3 handle that, or should I save that till question 2?
Well, so I guess I just read question 2 as just specific to Boulder Junction, and you're saying that downtown would incorporate that, or?
No, I don't think it does. I just at some point in time, question 2 or question 3
I think
open-ended.
Yeah, I guess I think if question 3 is like a catch-all, and we're going to prioritize and figure out like what the order is of everything, and so if we say Boulder Junction is, you know, not going to be done in the coming year, I don't want us to have spent a whole lot of time talking about question 2 until we know where we're putting that, I guess.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about Boulder Junction, but I do want to talk about downtown at an appropriate time, whether that's now or later.
Okay. Well, let's see if it fits in question 3, and we can do a catch-all discussion if category 3 doesn't feel catch-all enough to everyone. But 3 is, does council agree with staff's recommendations regarding prioritization of the work planning items, or do we want a different sequence of projects? So Bob, would you like to start maybe making a pitch for the downtown sequencing?
Well, sure. I'll talk about everything other than downtown. I think what staff has proposed in option 1 is great. And we just tackled ADUs. I'll talk about downtown in a second. I think everything else is in option 1 column is just right and just fine. So I support option 1 and staff's recommendations. With respect to downtown, I want to kind of build on what Tara said and what Brad said earlier. There's a kind of an interesting convergence of a whole bunch of stuff that's happening at the same time, and it's relatively uncoordinated. And just to kind of recap some of it for those who may not know, first of all, Downtown Boulder Partnership has been working on a vision plan for probably at least a year, maybe a little longer. The city is funding part of that. Several staff members, several council members have been involved in that vision plan, and that vision plan for downtown will be approved by the Downtown Boulder Partnership Board in January, and I hope that plan gets at least presented to council sometime next year. As previously talked about, there's a public spaces group. Matt and Tara are working on that along with staff. We have allocated a minimum of $12 million from the Community Culture, Safety, and Resilience Tax towards the civic area. And Pearl Street, I know Ally is taking the lead on, Lila Rhodes is taking the lead on that. Of course, we have the CU Conference Center that's being built up on the hill. And we've got some mobility issues around that CU and the biking community are trying to work on, and that could involve some connections to downtown. As Natalie mentioned earlier tonight, we have a mobility study for downtown that's going to be undertaken. There's been a lot of talk recently about a performing arts center. I know this is a discussion that's seems like it's gone on since dinosaurs walked the earth, but it seems to be maybe a little bit more real this time with Create Boulder taking the lead on that with ULI and with the Dairy Arts Center. And they're actually doing a lot of work on that, which I think some of us are participating in later this month. And then, of course, we do have the looming vacancy of both the BMOCA building, which the city owns, and the Atrium building, which the city owns, both of which are landmarked. So it just seems like there's a whole lot of stuff going on in that kind of south downtown 13th Street, CU Conference Center, area that is all happening kind of all at once. And I suppose the city can either participate in that or not. I'd like to see the city participate in that. I completely understand that putting staff time towards that could have the undesirable consequence of nudging some of these other things down the road. And I'm not suggesting that, but what I'd like to suggest is perhaps Brad and his team could go back and think about this for a few weeks, and maybe at our retreat in February or something like that, some point in time in the next couple of months, Brad's team could come back and talk about what they could do for the city to be a leader and a participant in what's going on in a lot of different work streams with the civic area downtown, and how the city could be involved in that and take a lead in that, quite frankly. And if there are other work plan implications to that, maybe there are, maybe they're not. But I don't want to ask Brad to answer that question tonight. I want to give his team a little bit of time to think about it. Maybe come back in January or at the February retreat and let us know that.
Thanks, Bob. Others on ordering, sequencing, prioritization? Lauren?
Yeah, so I appreciate what Bob just said. I do think that, because if I'm understanding right, the civic area and downtown planning was seemed like it might mostly fall under comprehensive planning, which also includes Boulder Junction and Area 3 Planning Reserve. And because of the alignment of a bunch of things coming up with the city, for me, that would be my top comprehensive planning item. Again, I totally leave it up to the planning department how that impacts those other two items, but just personally, I would like to see that get the attention that it needs sooner rather than later, so that we can help make sure the rest of the processes run forward smoothly. In terms of the other priorities, I would, and I mentioned this in my hotline, I mean, occupancy is, in my mind, one of the ways we can provide housing, more housing options for people fastest. And so to me, since we're in this housing crisis, it's important for us to do the things that will make change for our community quickly. And, you know, I love that we're looking at expanding ADUs, but when we saw that huge bump in ADUs, we were talking about 80 units is the maximum that we've ever created in 1 year. And that has a lot to do with, you know, how long it takes to build and permit things in our community. And that's not something that is going to change quickly. So trying to figure out how we best utilize the spaces that we have is something that I think is really important. I know that you mentioned that the use tables have a lot of things that are really close to completion, and that's really exciting. Here in our option 1 for the memo, it does say that module 3 is only 10% complete. And so I guess in my mind, I'm wondering if does that have the same, does pausing or delaying between two of the modules have sort of the same loss of efficiency, or is there an opportunity to pause at that point and maybe switch gears a little bit and do something, one of these things that I think that I would like to see us focus on earlier?
Is that a question for Brad?
I think it is a question, yeah. Can we switch between modules?
I'm going to defer to Carl, but my sense is it is a little bit more discrete, so that may be one of the chess pieces we can talk about. But Carl, can you confirm that for us?
We're coming with an ordinance in December with module 2, so we're anticipating that module 2 will be complete by the end of the year. Then we'd have to start module 3. So obviously that, if that were to be paused or tabled or whatever, that would be a logical place to stop the project if council wanted more energy to go into another facet for us to work on.
Thank you.
Lauren, any other prioritization or listing?
Not at the moment.
Thanks. Mark, and then Aaron?
Yeah, I'm also happy with the staff recommendation in option 1, but I also share Bob's desire that there be some sort of organizing presence for all of the components of the civic area and downtown refurbishment. I would hate to have these things being done by separate groups and with separate approaches or interests, and I'd like to see the city take the leadership role in that and move it along. And we have a lot of money that we're going to be investing in that area, and I'd like there to be an organizing principle behind it, and I think staff can do that. So I hope you will be able to find a way to be involved. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Aaron, then Nicole.
Yeah, so I appreciate the work y'all have done on the prioritization. I think you've landed generally in a good spot, and I appreciate that you've got a lot of balls in the air, and I think you've done a good job in terms of trying to figure out how to bring them all to a restful conclusion in a reasonable time frame. I think I messed up the analogy, but anyway. So just but some specific comments that I'll say. One is on Boulder Junction Phase 2. I get that it's not timely, it's not within scope to finish the entire thing in the next year, but I appreciated your concept of having a milestone in Q3 or maybe Q4 of 2023 that we could get done with this council before moving to final completion, maybe 9 to 12 months later. So appreciate that, and I just would really urge you to continue to shoot for that, and hopefully that timetable works out, because I think having us approve those land use changes in the plan amendments would be fantastic, and then let the implementation take another however long it takes. So thanks for that idea. I agree with it. I'd like to echo Lauren's point about the importance and value of occupancy reform. And here, what I wonder is if maybe we could take a little bit of a simpler approach. I think you mentioned a working group to be formed. In my experience, working groups take a long time, and I don't know that time frame that you've got there is feasible if we're starting a working group from scratch and carrying it through that whole process. So I wonder if my proposal here, my thought here would be, could we do this the way you've been doing the ADUs, which is there wasn't a work group formed here. Instead, y'all did some comparable cities analysis. You looked at the feedback we've gotten from the community in the past, which of course we got a lot of. We have gotten a lot of in occupancy over the past, and then come forward with some options that we could consider through our boards, right? So like you're talking about with ADUs, involve our housing and planning boards in terms of giving recommendations, and I'll echo Lauren's thought about the possibility of doing this relatively simply. Denver, our nearby neighbor, has the precedent of that 5 unrelated that they passed. Was that maybe about a year ago, and it was actually referended, is that a verb? Unsuccessfully, so it stuck. It had supported their community. Obviously, Denver's not Boulder. I'm not saying we're the same city at all, but I think it's worth looking at. So that's just a thought. We're not trying to determine exactly how we handle occupancy tonight, so I probably shouldn't say something too specific, because I don't want us to try to argue about exactly the best way to do it. But my point being that if you ran it through the boards and kind of leaned on the simpler side with options, that could give us something to consider maybe a little sooner, more in the Q2 timeframe than in the Q3 timeframe. So I'll put that out there for consideration. And then I appreciate what my colleagues have said about being involved in the downtown planning. I agree that that's good. We do have a scheduling issue here, right? If we're going to move that up, you've got to ad hoc. It's probably not super simple for us to be significantly involved in that. But one thought, I know when we talked about this last, generally majority of council wanted to keep Area 3 Planning Reserve moving forward sooner rather than later. But I do believe that the underlying impetus there was to absolutely be ready for the major update to the comprehensive plan. And I think that we had a strong consensus that we need to be ready for the major update with the planning reserve. But personally, I'd say if you could get some more downtown work done a little sooner, if the planning reserve takes a little bit longer but is still ready in time, that would be fine by me. So that's one possibility of finding some time under the couch cushions, to mangle another analogy, there. And I think that's it. So again, appreciate all the amazing work you're doing and looking forward to getting some progress on all these fantastic initiatives in the next year.
Thanks, Aaron, Nicole, and Tara.
Thank you. And thanks for, laying out our different options fairly clearly as well. It's really helpful. I think just overall, so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from, for me, housing and finding a way to get people housed and to stay housed in our city is really my main area of priority. It feels like every week I am talking to workers, young folks who are being priced out of our city. They are moving to other communities. These are our workers and the people who keep a lot of our businesses going. I think I've mentioned before, none of my staff live in Boulder anymore. So, for me, thinking about what's the fastest way that we are getting to more housing is really what I'm interested in trying to move as quickly as possible on. And, to that end, I see occupancy, as Lauren does, as kind of the fastest way to open up spaces that already exist to folks in our community. With that, I really would love to act with some urgency there. We have heard a lot from the community in terms of what their areas of concern are. We have a lot of folks on council who represent different pockets of the community, and I feel like we could come up with a sort of a good enough proposal, just something to put forward that we could move on with, again, with the idea that this is something that is relatively easy to change down the road. So, if we get 2 years in, we realize, we really should have had this other thing in there too, we can change it. So, I also just like Lauren's idea of trying to move a little faster on this. I think this is a place where, we will, regardless of what happens, we're not going to make everybody in the community happy. But this is a place where we as a body can decide how we're going to move forward and that we can take some of the heat from staff in the same way that we're doing with CAN, with transportation. We decided this was going to be an area of focus because it was a way that we could try to minimize severe accidents. There's a lot of data that show that. I mean, this is also a way that we can move forward with opening up some more housing opportunities to people in our community. So I really like the idea of trying to move a little faster with that, with the understanding that we on council would really, we would own that, right? That when and if people are complaining in the future, that's on us, right? That's not staff. So anyway, so that's my kind of only main area of feedback there. We are really in a situation where a lot of good people are leaving our community, and we need to figure out how we can get more folks to stay as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Nicole. Tara, then Mark. I do have a question for Nuria on occupancy. Just to refresh, we're not enforcing that right now, are we?
We sort of remain in the place that we were throughout the pandemic, which is certainly if we receive information that speaks to life safety issues, we will certainly do that. But at the moment, when we were talking about that last year, frankly, we didn't have staff enough to do it, and we didn't have an interest and ability to move that. And so we are still in that same pattern. But if it involves life safety issue, I just want to be clear that we certainly want to be taking a look at that for safety purposes.
Thanks. Tara, then Mark.
I do agree that, of course, housing is the most important thing. But I will say, though, when it came to CAN, that all nine of us agreed on prioritizing that. And even ADUs, I think we had almost total buy-in by the council for ADUs. But when it comes to occupancy, and it comes to the fact that we had a ballot, the democratic process, and bedrooms lost, I think we have to be really careful to make sure that we get the kind of community engagement that will not cause anger, stress, anguish, because everybody doesn't feel heard. Now, I know you can over community engage, if that's even a verb, but I feel like we have to really be careful. If the library district does win and the next council comes and says, oh, well, I didn't like that outcome, are we going to say, I mean, you have to listen to the voters. That's democracy after all. So I really do think we need to have, I believe that it was a staff member that said that occupancy wasn't going to be easy because of the community stress and disagreement on it. Whereas ADUs, there was much more agreement on it. So I don't think that we should take a shortcut when it comes to occupancy and community engagement. And I want there to be occupancy reform. I just feel like we need to bring everybody with us, or at least as 80%. So I agree with you that we can find something that's good enough. I'm a big fan of good enough, but we just have to keep in mind the ramifications and political scene.
Good enough is a life-changing philosophy. Mark?
I have one comment, but first I'm going to say I agree with Tara's comment. Elections do have consequence and they do have meaning, and it is important to be respectful of the results of an election. That doesn't mean you can't have occupancy reform. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that it needs to be done with sufficient care and caution and respect for those who are either nervous or apprehensive about it. And you do need to bring the community with you, particularly in light of the fact that there was such an election. We should not feel that we have full discretion to do whatever we want, because that's not respectful of the democratic process. Having said that, doesn't mean we can't have this conversation and we can't have some reasonable occupancy reform. But I'm a little concerned about taking shortcuts on the process. My other comment is with respect to the planning reserve scheduled for Q2 in 2024. There's a great deal of consultant work to be done on that, as I understood the memo. And my question is, can we not engage the consultants a little early and give them a scope and say, go off and do your consultant work? I'm not quite sure why it all has to proceed in one manner, as opposed to engaging the consultants and letting them prepare the way.
If I may, I think we can answer that quickly, and Christopher, if you could chime in. I believe that is true. We wanted to represent the overall project. And of course, the column that we're looking at with option 1 is a completion date. That may run pretty, but I'm going to put you on the spot, Christopher, if you could confirm that conversation you and I had.
Yeah, that's right. So that Q2 2024 is anticipated completion of that work. So we would, at least at this point, would be prepared to move forward with that study next year and come back to council in sort of late Q1, early Q2 with the preliminary scope of work and those items to get that ball rolling and get those consultants engaged. But you are correct that the overall consultant scope would be significant for that project.
I think the question is, if we just cut loose the consultant piece of it, does that really impact our overall work capacity? And could we do that, put it on a shelf, and then pick up Area 3 fairly later down the road, Christopher?
Well, that is a bit of a more challenging question, only because we really have not had the opportunity to really scope that out and understand exactly what those consultant needs are going to be, and to really frame that out. the project, as we have at least initially thought about it, regardless of the timeline that it's on, it will involve and engage a number of consultants to do those technical studies. You know, it's going to take us a little, even if we started tomorrow, it's a 2 to 3 month process to get a consultant on board, just to get through the procurement process and that sort of thing. So, you know, we certainly would be interested in bringing those consultants on board as quickly as we can, but until we kind of wrap our hands around exactly what the scope of that project is and the, you know, the questions we're really trying to answer, it's difficult for me to say exactly.
Christopher, your answer is persuasive and substantive. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Aaron, then Nicole, then I'll go.
Yeah, just want to, for a couple of my colleagues who mentioned respecting the will of the voters, just want to be clear that nobody's saying we should redo bedrooms and just pass it despite the fact that it lost. So just want to make that clear that we're all keeping that in mind. But as you also referred to, we can look into occupancy reform without trying to redo bedrooms. So we'll keep that balance in mind carefully, just to make that clear. Nobody's trying to override the will of the voters. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Nicole?
Yeah, I just kind of had a similar follow-up, and I was just going to ask that, you know, as we're talking about things that have happened in the past, that we be really specific with our data points that we're using. So, you know, for example, the bedrooms measure was not a ballot measure on whether or not people wanted occupancy reform, right? I mean, we know that because we as a council made it a council priority. It was really, it wasn't asking, do you want occupancy reform? It was asking, do you want it in this specific way? And, you know, I'm sure you all, especially, you know, Mark, Tara, who were also campaigning Lauren last year, heard a lot of people say, I love this idea of occupancy reform. Yes, 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 we need this in our community. And I'm a little concerned that we're going to get, you know, these really big dormitories and things if we do it in this specific way. So just asking that as we move forward, we're really clear in what it is, because otherwise, you know, I think we do enter a place where, you know, Aaron was just noting where, you know, we don't want people to start thinking that we're trying to overthrow the will of voters. That's not what we're doing here. So I think being specific can really help. And just, you know, really liked Lauren's idea of engaging some of the key groups that we don't often hear from, open up a you know, survey that allows a lot of people across the city to chime in on our ideas and kind of go from there.
Thanks, Nicole. So I think I maybe break a little bit from my colleagues here. I don't totally agree with the sequencing. I would prioritize ADUs, occupancy reform, and then what I'm going to say zoning for affordable housing. But what I'd really like to see is the missing middle that we discussed 2 weeks ago, prioritized under there. That's why I was asking some pointed questions about the large lots. I would really like to see this council move forward with some duplexing by right. And I think that's an easy place to start because we were already there. Like we were at the point of voting on in these couple zones, we could do duplex or triplex by right. And it's just a subset of housing that's already on large lots that makes, I think, a lot more sense to do, you know, to Junie's earlier point, duplexing, you know, a side-by-side attached rather than an ADU in the backyard where it maybe makes a little bit less sense. So I would really like for us to at least get that moving forward while we work through some, you know, the larger duplexing questions for the city, but we could, you know, at least have some places where it makes so much sense to be moving forward. There was so much engagement on that. And again, it got to the finish line and then like the ball dropped. So I definitely support Lauren's idea of sort of shelving mod 3 of, was it use tables? I think use tables. So I would shelve that and make room to make sure that we get at there. I would think in the first 2 quarters of this coming year, occupancy and ADUs should be across the finish line. And then I would like to see the you know, affordable housing is completed, you know, zoning in Q2, Q3. I'm a little bit worried about what all that that it encompasses and want to make sure that it is what we would want it to be. And then I think Aaron maybe mentioned like we can maybe soften area 3, like we need it several years from now, but it doesn't have to be a top thing right now. And then Boulder Junction phase 2, I would probably deprioritize. It's already not till Q2 24, but I would like to see these other things for sure getting finished in the coming year before there's a council change. So I would just like the order of the priorities I would want to see. I know that it's maybe not exactly in line with this, but I just want to make sure that some of the things that are discrete, sort of surgical, to use a term that Brad used earlier, changes are done and not scheduled for Q3 in a way that can, you know, if something pops up, like my whole tenure on council, a surprising number of things have popped up. We had COVID, we've had all these community tragedies, things get moved back. So I would like to see a different prioritization of a couple things that I think are very important to the sort of this housing focused council bumped up to the first 2 quarters so that we know that even with some slippage, they're getting done. Lauren and then Brad.
Thanks, Rachel. I wanted to echo a lot of what you said. You know, that really aligns, you know, ADUs, occupancy reform, and zoning affordability. You know, those are also my top 3 priorities and what I care most about seeing, you know, having us move forward on. I do want to be respectful of what staff is working on and has in the works. But yeah, if all other things being equal, absolutely those would be my top 3. And I agree with Rachel that within zoning for affordable housing, I don't know that, in my mind, the staff memo didn't necessarily capture exactly what I want to see us move forward with there. And I think that we should look at scoping that in detail, which I'm sure we will at some point, but just keeping in mind that maybe we do a similar thing with having a section of things that are easy to move forward with, and then maybe having another section of things that we're looking at, but not that are on hold. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Lauren. And I think that this was your your retreat work priority. I'd be very curious to hear more about what you envisioned on that list. But first, over to Brad.
Well, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Friend. I was going to offer up the possibility of me going through this list item by item and reflecting what I think I'm hearing from most of you as a way to kind of capture the pro and cons that I've heard. It sounds very workable. I would want to maybe go through that list, and then if we were sitting down at a table, I would ask staff to kick me under the table if they disagree. So since we don't have a table, I'll ask them to agree with how I characterize the possibility and ask them to be very honest again, like I mentioned at the beginning of this whole study session about the balancing of that. And then, of course, get feedback from council. But with your permission, I'd be happy to kind of take a stab at it.
Right now or at a future date?
Right now.
I invite. Take a stab. I will kick you under a virtual table if need be.
Very good. I'm hearing that from most of you on ADUs, you would like to support the staff recommendation, which gets us towards completion in Q2 of next year. I'm hearing from most of you that on Boulder Junction Phase 2, you recognize that there's momentum towards that, especially the incremental piece that we identified as an interim step by the end of the summer. but maybe we can pull a little capacity off of that to look at the civic area, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Under the site review criteria, I'm hearing following staff's recommendation and just getting that across the finish line. On the use tables, I'm hearing, yep, go ahead and get module 2 off across the finish line, but let's put module 3 on hold for, let's call it a year, and take that capacity for some other things. On occupancy reform, I'm hearing that we should, and here there's maybe the greatest mixture of kind of opinions, but more or less follow the staff recommendation, but be cognizant of the engagement and maybe reaction to the level of engagement. If it stays within scope, still being able to get that through at, I would call it early Q3. For zoning for affordable housing, I'm hearing again most of you saying that you support the staff recommendation, but maybe we could take a little sidestep to see how viable the large lot ordinance is as kind of an early hit, and when, if that is viable. Otherwise, coming back to you with either way, coming back to you with a revised scope relative to that, or the original scope that is being presented as part of this, and variations. I'm hearing from most of you on Area 3 that we could put that on hold and take that capacity into some of these other areas. As a practical matter, I think an entire year, and then revisit it. And then on the Civic Center in downtown, use at least enough capacity to kind of develop the scope, work with the city manager's office, and have a comprehensive vision for that, also in partnership with the other departments and such, and give that a full scope. Now is the time I'd ask Charles and KJ to react to what I just said.
Yeah, that was a fine summary, Brent.
Yeah, you did great.
And you both feel comfortable with the kind of trade-offs that I discussed? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Brad. I'm going to kick you under the table a little bit, but first I'm going to go to Lauren and then Nicole. See if they have any kicks too.
Just a little one. So I think that what was outlined in the memo sort of around zoning and affordable housing, including looking at open space requirements and things like that, along with, I think it also spoke to the inclusionary housing fees a little bit. I also did want to see us look at sort of density bonuses and streamlined approval processes for projects that have high levels of affordability. And to me, I feel like, that kind of section of things that I brought up when we were doing our inclusionary housing discussion really probably best fit within that work plan item, and was part of what I intended when we discussed this at the retreat. So yeah, I think, and I've outlined sort of a lot of, in more detail in my memo, what I was hoping for, but I do think that is, I would like to see that be bigger than what it's currently being outlined as. Thanks.
Thanks, Lauren. Nicole?
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify my views on the civic area downtown. I'm really not as interested in taking capacity to use it for that right now. I would really like to see us move forward faster instead and use whatever capacity we have for something that is more housing focused. if we can, I'm going to make a really bad pun of just being a little bolder, right? Being willing to, you know, make some decisions and just kind of move forward based on the knowledge that we have as elected officials, as representatives of our community. I think, you know, for me, and I keep echoing this about occupancy reform, that really feels like one to me where we have a lot of knowledge about what our community will and will not tolerate, and just thinking about how we can use extra capacity that we might put into, say, civic area or downtown, to use that instead for, you know, if we were bold enough to kind of give you some clear, specific guidance on what we might be looking for to get some feedback on and move forward with, you know, does that feel like something that could be moved up a little bit, so that rather than looking at, for example, early Q3, we could maybe look at early Q2?
Sorry, just a process thing. It said the recording stopped. That's troublesome. Do we know what's going on there? So we want to make sure and record everything.
Just asking the team in the background if there are issues with the recording we need to know.
Thanks. We're back.
Great. Sorry, Nicole, to interrupt. Go ahead, finish.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Just sort of to summarize, I'm less interested in putting extra capacity into the civic area downtown right now. I really would like to put it into things that are going to help with our housing crisis a little bit more.
Thanks, Nicole. I will, and I'm sorry to have my camera off. It just keeps freezing when I turn it on. So I'm going to keep it off. Sorry. I'll do a couple straw polls, maybe, Nicole, here to see where people align, because that was my kicks under the table. Brad would have been, I'm not sure I heard the same like majority will articulated yet on a couple of these things. So I'm not sure I heard from everybody that we want Boulder Junction to stay at the top, or site review to get across the finish line. Occupancy, I think I heard strong request for that to maybe bump up to Q1 or 2. So right now it's Q2 to 3. So I just want to check in with people on that. For zoning, I think Lauren already spoke to that, but I think that maybe we want a scope on what's included in that pretty quickly, so that we, like, it's hard to say where that falls in the matrix or the prioritization if we're not clear on what's falling within it, or maybe what's outside of it. And so, you know, are we capturing everything that we wanted in that thing? And then I agree. I thought that area 3 was maybe demoted a little bit. So if people are okay, before we move on to question 2, I'll get you in a second, Aaron. Maybe we could do a couple straw polls just to see where people want things. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I think a couple straw polls are a great idea. Talking about the Boulder Junction phase 2, just one thing that you said before was, you mentioned, it's not going to get done until 2024 anyway. Just to reiterate that there is a real substantial milestone plan for, you know, Q3 or 4 2023 of like adopting the plan revisions and adopting the land use map changes. And if we delay that effort, those won't get done with this council, and those would be significant steps in this project. So I just want to make that clear in terms of the trade-offs.
Great reminder. It was mostly just I didn't feel that we had adequately checked in on that one. It's listed as Q2 2024 in the completion. I agree. There's a thing, and that is a whole separate question too. So that one I just think we haven't talked about too much here.
Totally.
Okay. So maybe let's do a show of hands, and somebody just, you know, kick me under the table, raise a hand if you don't like any of these straw polls. But does everyone agree, or is there a majority support for area 3 kind of getting pushed down or demoted or delayed if we needed to? Can I see if people are okay with that happening?
I'll just say Brad raised his hand right as.
Oh, Brad, sorry. Are you voting with us there?
Yeah, I have a little nuance I could offer on the zoning for affordability. I could wait till you get to that point or offer it now.
Maybe just let me just get through the area 3, just because I'd already, my own hand was up. So I just want to make sure, was Brad's understanding of that one accurate, that we're comfortable with sort of slowing that down a little bit to get to some other things first? I see Lauren, Aaron, me, nobody, Nicole. So no, Mark's got a virtual hand up, which is confusing to me right now. Is that a raised hand, or is that a question? So I think that's 5 then for area 3, kind of slowing down. Yeah, no, dang. Question mark, Wallach.
If we're going to be housing focused, as a comment, I would want to point out that area 3 planning reserve is ultimately intended to be a source of housing. And, keep pushing it back and back, you will not find very much greater opportunity for affordable or middle income housing than on land, a good portion of which we own. And so to continue to kick that one down the road makes not as much sense to me. And my other comment is with respect to the civic area. I like to think that we can chew gum and walk at the same time. We have 8 priorities here. 6 are dedicated to housing, including Boulder Junction. 7 if you want to characterize area 3 in that respect. And so kicking the, not spending planning resources on the civic area and downtown makes little sense to me. We cannot be only about housing, even though it is the highest priority, but most of our priorities here deal with housing. I think we ought to have the opportunity to spend some resources on the civic area and downtown as well, because I think it's important for our tourist industry, it's important for our community, it's important for our businesses, and I like to think we can do 2 things.
Area 3, Junie, then Aaron, then Nicole.
I feel like me and Mark, we're like a choir, because we've been saying the same thing since we started here on council back in 2019, and we're almost in 2023. I just think if we keep delaying and delaying, it's just gonna take years and years. And all we're doing in area 3, my understanding from the last time, it's just a study, even though I know our hope, because we're a council that is focused on housing and affordable housing, but that's not essentially what's going to happen. It's a study at first. So I just don't understand why we keep pushing it. If we pause it, and when is it going to happen? And my understanding, even if we were to decide to do housing in that area, it's gonna take a long time. So the more we push this out, as Mark mentioned, the less likely we are to know what we can do with the area. And with the hope of eventually creating more housing, I just don't think that is the right thing to do. I would support keeping it where it is so that we can hopefully get there, because pausing it is not helpful. I don't think so. And we've been advocating for this since 2019, or since the retreat of 2020. And here we are almost 3 years later, and we keep pausing and pausing. So I don't agree with that. I would appreciate if council just keep moving forward with eventually getting that study done. Thank you.
Junie, Aaron, Nicole, Tara.
I think Junie just spoke, so I think that's me. Just to clarify, I think the discussion on Area 3 was not to delay the eventual conclusion of that project, but we can't start the next phase after this one until the 2025 major update to the comprehensive plan. And so it was just saying, well, we could pause for a little while so long as we still get it done in time for the 2025 comprehensive plan, just to be clear. It's just, but if the majority doesn't want to do it, that's fine. I just wanted to be clear. It's not about trying to keep it from happening, but just we can't get to the next phase until 2025 anyway. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Aaron. Nicole, Tara?
Yeah, I actually just wanted to make the same clarification that Aaron did and just make sure that I understand it. So Aaron just answered my question. It doesn't mean that we're not going to do it. There's just a discrete point when it needs to be done by, and we're just saying rather than do it out here, Brad, there's still time, right? We can still.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
That was my understanding too. Tara?
I don't know if Ally Rhodes is on the line, but Parks does have a lot to do with Area 3. So can we ask her if she has anything to add, since she'll have a lot to do with Area 3? Or is that inappropriate, Brad?
I think we can. I know she's listening. I don't know if she's immediately on or available.
Ally Rhodes, show yourself.
I will mention that parks is certainly a very important part of that, especially the geography and the acreage, but it does fit into a larger package of all the infrastructure look and those types of things. Looks like she's going to be able to join just here in a couple seconds.
I was just going to say, I want to be mindful because it is not always expected that staff be around, but if she has been tagged.
If you're in your pajamas, Ally, we are not here to judge, and keep your camera off if that's comfortable, I think. Or maybe we can move on while we're waiting. And Ally, if you raise your hand if you get here and would like to speak, that's fine. Is that okay with you, Tara? Oh, there she is. What
Don't be mad at me, Ally.
We're fighting. I have real clothes on still. At least you can see my sweater.
Move on while we're waiting. And Ally, if you raise your hand if you get here and would like to speak, that's fine. Is that okay with you, Tara?
Oh, sorry. I'm having a delay because I'm listening.
I'm not saying that right now.
We're fighting. Sorry, I was watching it online and I didn't stop that. That was weird. It was very confusing. Sorry about that. When I'm not participating, I watch online because I'm always afraid I'm gonna I don't know. Anyway, Area 3. I'm Ally Rhodes, folks. I'm the Director of Parks and Recreation. Here's what we know because we talked about Area 3 and the recently accepted and City Council approved Boulder Parks and Recreation Master Plan. Area 3 was always purchased. The 187 acres that are designated as parkland was designated to meet future needs of the community. Based on current analysis, we don't need that for the next 10 years or maybe even further. And we do have property within the city that we would love to develop. Violet Park is in our most immediate plans, but Valmont City Park is certainly going to be needed and would be our priority before anything in Area 3. Did that answer your question?
Do you have anything against us going forward with our study, or are you good with that, or?
I don't get to decide that. I don't have any concerns at all. The baseline urban services study, I understand the value of it. I don't have concerns. If you ask specifically around park priorities, it won't inform our development in the next 10 years, unless you should determine to move forward with housing development. And then of course there would be appropriate parkland associated with that because of the requirements of Area 1 city levels of service.
Good with that, Tara? Okay, it seemed like a lot of hands and now not. So that was a losing straw poll, I think, though. But let me if I could just count those hands again, because I got confused because then there were virtual hands going up. So a show of hands for anyone who was comfortable with Area 3 being sort of scooched back, but still done in the right time frame for 2025. I see Tara, me, Lauren, Nicole, Aaron. So that is 5 now. Okay, so that's gonna free up some staff time as needed, it looks like. Agreeing with you there, Brad.
Speaking of freeing up staff time, can we let Ms. Rhodes go?
I think so. That's up to Tara.
Thank you, Ally.
Let's see. I think that just the only sounds like just Boulder Junction. Maybe I was just unclear in that we hadn't talked about it. Is there? Just want to make sure that people are comfortable, as Brad said and Aaron has indicated, with Boulder Junction staying on track, at least for the first milestone thing. We just didn't have a lot of comments on that, so I didn't want to not touch base on it. So show of hands, people good with that staying. I see Lauren, me, Tara, Nicole's scooching in her chair. I can't tell if there is really only, we got a Nicole. So I think it's Lauren, Aaron, me, Tara, Nicole, did everybody say?
Could you repeat that question one more time, please?
Brad had indicated that Boulder Junction would keep towards the top of the list, and Lauren and I had indicated like we had a different top three, but then there's a milestone coming up that Aaron indicated we want to get through, and so just wanted to kind of get a show of hands. Are we comfortable? Is Brad's recap accurate there, Nicole?
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify on this. This is relating back to the discussion that we had back in September, right? And the kind of direction that we focused on at that point. And it's basically just to kind of stay going in that direction. Am I understanding that right? Okay, then yes.
And when we still have question 2 to get to. So Nicole's, I think there were 5. Nicole, me, Lauren, Aaron.
I'm voting yes. Do we vote for what Brad wants? Because that's what I want.
That was what Brad wanted, and you voted yes for it. Okay, so good. Just wanted to clarify that one. I think I'm a little bit confused on the occupancy. Brad, is it possible to get that within quarter 1 or 2? Because I thought I heard people saying that, but then your recap was kind of still quarter 3. So wanted to clarify council's intention there.
Yeah, so, if we haven't gotten to the use table yet, if there's agreement about the module 3 being put on hold, that gets us a little capacity. I'm hesitant to suggest that that's quarter 1 or even 2, because there are some unknowns about that. What we definitely would be doing with that is coming to you, with a study session late quarter 1, quarter 2. And if it is able to stay in the scope that some of you envision, then I would say we would still be able to commit to that quarter 3. But there were differing opinions about what the scope either could be or should be, or what the amount of engagement would be necessary or would just be imposed from the public. So that has some variability to it. I don't know if that illuminated anything. As I attempted to explain.
Okay, so I guess I'm hearing you to say like quarter 1 or 2 would be ambitious, so we should keep it quarter 2 and 3 while we work through what the engagement is. So
yeah, I'm trying to just be honest in the assessment of effort.
Okay. Any concerns from council for that instead of a straw poll, Nicole?
Yeah, I think I'm just still a little not understanding kind of what the proposed engagement is and what kind of consensus is among us for what that might be. So I think Lauren in her hotline post to kind of proposed, us kind of taking our best knowledge that we have from the many, many, many conversations we've had around this, coming up with a proposal, offering that to some of the maybe some key focus groups of constituencies that we don't feel like we've heard from as much, or that we are not representing, and then moving forward from there. And I think I'm just still a little bit unclear on what the alternative is that's being considered.
Is that a question for Brad?
Possibly. Brad, I think it's really just a question of, is there a place for a faster engagement process if council is willing to take our knowledge that we have?
For occupancy specifically, yes. I have been told, and others have asserted, some among you, that if council took a very surgical, to use that term again, gave very surgical direction on what that policy were to be, and to your point, acknowledge or recognize as staff, I think we would naturally want to bring to your awareness that there will be a lot of public input and reaction to, a fairly specific directional approach from council on that. But if that were to be the case, if council said, we think the number should be X, that's really the main thing, go ahead and move forward with that. That could be a very, potentially be the quicker scenario. Even in that scenario, I would say still late quarter 2, beginning of quarter 3. There are just a lot of variables around occupancy.
Thanks, Brad. I saw Aaron, but then his hand disappeared. Did we lose Aaron?
And please call him Lauren.
What's that?
The hand disappeared. Please call him Lauren.
Lauren.
It kind of seems like we're trying to, make a fair. Brad, we've been asking you about sort of if we took this or like readjusted things, it sort of feels like between all of the things that we've proposed around potential, like taking a little bit of scope out of use tables and standards and sort of being more specific about what we're asking for engagement on with occupancy and what that engagement looks like. You're still saying Q2 and Q3, which is the same. And I guess I would wonder, is there, when you come forward with this scope and engagement, could you try and have a proposal for what a Q1, Q2 program might look like that we could weigh against a Q2, Q3 program for this item?
Yeah, I appreciate the observation and question, Councilmember Folkerts. If I can restate what I think you're asking is, we're doing a little shifting here and talking about things with use tables, getting rid of module 3 for a while. That builds us some capacity. Where is that capacity going on the policy side of things? And could that be an occupancy? My answer, which maybe was lost in that, is yes. There are some caveats, though, again, about kind of the expanded sense that I'm hearing from some, but not from others. But yes, that extra capacity from moving module 3 would definitely put us in a space on occupancy to prioritize that. Maybe I could ask Charles and Carl to kind of weigh in and see if the way I framed that makes sense or they've got some nuance on that.
I'll certainly defer to Carl ultimately, but that makes a lot of sense, Brad. I think that tracks with what our understanding is.
I agree.
I think what thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate that. And what I'm trying to do, Councilmember Folkerts, in explaining that is just talking to the ambiguities that we want to make sure council understands around occupancy, as opposed to, say, the site review and use, which are more prescribed. I can offer up some thoughts too on the zoning for affordable housing when we get to that point.
Okay, thank you, Brad.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks, Lauren. Aaron, is the hand's back up?
The hand is back. So that was helpful, Brad and Lauren, for that clarification. So Rachel, I wonder maybe if this next straw poll might become, not to take our facilitation, but do we agree to delay the module 3 of the use tables to free up some capacity to get occupancy moved up a bit?
That's exactly what I was going to do. So let's see a show of hands. Are we comfortable delaying module 3 of use tables to prioritize some other things happening quicker? I see Aaron, me. Is that it? Nicole. I think Lauren's disappeared. Junie and Bob are off camera. Lauren's up. So that's 4. Junie, oh, is that a question, Junie? Or is that a yay?
No, it's not a yes.
Okay.
I'm just a bit confused, or maybe things are just not going the way I hope things would go, because it seems like we're delaying a lot, actually. It seems like we're closer to option 3, looking at the matrix summary, and we're just delaying almost everything. So
I think we're just shuffling. So it's not delaying. Some things are going to get sped up and some things are getting, it's more like council's weighing in on a proposed order from staff and deciding whether to shuffle. So like, does occupancy get moved up and then module 3 moved down is sort of the question, I think. things like that. I'm taking that as not a yes vote, which would make it a 4-4.
Yeah, it's a no. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I think that module 3 will proceed, and then if I heard Brad correctly, occupancy stays back at Q23 as a result of that?
Yeah, that would be the consequence of that. Very solidly in Q3 at this point, I would say.
Okay. And just maybe a procedural question. Given that Matt Benjamin's not here, is that something that we could, revisit with additional council members, or is this like a one and done? Maybe that's to Teresa.
I think that, yes, I think that is a question for me. So if you're, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. If you're asking, could you bring this back at another meeting where Council Member Benjamin is here? Certainly, if that's the will of council, you could do that. Typically to receive council direction, we would look to the members of council who are here now, particularly with something that is not quite a vote, but it walks and quacks like a vote.
And I don't remember if he weighed in on that on his hotline, or if it would be
I don't either.
Something that we can take into account. So if anybody knows that. Okay. Junie, is that an old hand? Brad?
I completely agree with Teresa. I would point out what's a little bit unique about this is coming back for a vote really kind of entails coming back to all of them or many of the things, because we're talking about the interconnectedness of us. So it's a little more complicated than if this were a discrete issue that we'd be asking him to weigh in at some later point. But of course, we can do that however council wishes, but we may walk away fairly inclusive tonight without that.
Okay. Tara?
I mean, 1 to 2 versus 2 to 3. I mean, in the world of government, is what is like the next quarter that much of a big deal? It seems like Brad really wants us to wait till Q3. I'm just saying.
Well, and to be clear, it's not the waiting as much as that's the completion, because first we'd come to you and see for occupancy, for example, what is it that you'd like us to do, right? So that would actually give us the scope or not. And then depending on that scope, we could get it done quicker or not. So that's part of up to you as we think about it. So I want to make sure that, and I know Brad, you've said this a couple of times, that list on the thing is when it could be completed, not perhaps when it would start. So I want to be clear about that.
Nicole?
Well, I'm not done. Wait, hold on. Sorry. I'm just saying that first we said, yes, let's listen to staff. And now we're basically not listening to staff. So I'm just throwing that out there that it was a perfectly decent option 1, but.
Well, I guess I didn't hear the majority say that they agreed with the staff timeline. So that's why we're going through these kind of, so Nicole and then Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, just to that question of, what difference does a quarter make? And Brad, I mentioned this to you as well. And, maybe if you just want to have a chance to respond to everybody on cancel. But, for me, that's the difference of when leases are signed, right? So, I mean, if we're talking about earlier in, Q2, that's time for folks to make adjustments, to, kind of legally live with their, chosen people. And I don't, if we're waiting until Q3, then that's sort of pushing that off, right? Functionally a year or so. So that's for me where some of this urgency comes from, is just knowing how early folks start signing leases for the fall. And I'm not talking just about students either. So just folks in our community.
Appreciate that, Nicole. Aaron, and then hopefully move a bit on.
Yeah, and I'd say we probably, this has been a complex discussion, so we probably don't want to try to revisit it at another meeting. But I did check on Matt's hotline. He was interested in accelerating occupancy, but he certainly didn't weigh in on should we delay module 3 of the use tables in order to get some capacity to work on occupancy. The thing that I might suggest on that in terms of, because there is some interest in tackling this, is perhaps, Brad, we can get that study session where we start talking about occupancy sooner rather than later. And then if council might give direction that is more kind of concise, to Nuria's point, we might give direction, do something simpler or something more complicated. And then that could have a big influence on how quickly it gets it done. So to folks who want to make it happen a little quicker, you might want to be sharpening, and myself included, sharpening our pencils to think about a simpler approach rather than a more complex one potentially. But Brad, so do you think, so is it possible to get a study session on it sooner rather than later?
I think these plans, particularly around occupancy reform and zoning, did contemplate a study session in the first quarter, but I'm going to have to defer to Charles and Carl to refresh my memory in that regard.
Yeah, that was in the timeline to come back at the end of Q1 with a study session to talk about occupancy and zoning for affordable housing. We did want to have enough time to complete the analysis of the peer communities and come up with options. I think if we were to put it at the beginning of Q1, that analysis would not be as complete.
Yeah, and this, thank you, Carl. Charles, did you have anything to add?
No, I agree.
Good chance. This might be a good point for me to also say, there's a lot more art than science here, and I'm trying to be careful that we don't try to act as if these timelines are something that we can be absolute precise on. The site review use table pretty clear on, occupancy and zoning less clear. And while those completion dates are shown, again, some of the complexity is just hard to anticipate. We might find ourselves doing the work sessions that we indicate we can do fairly early in the year, but any change in scope and such, or even circumstances, could change that fairly significantly. Not to revisit the module 3, but just that was kind of the point. And if that were put on hold, it maybe gives a little more wiggle room to deal with those uncertainties. But that was kind of the logic in parsing some of this.
Thanks, Brad. So I think maybe the only thing left on my list was just Lauren's question about the scope for affordable zoning stuff. And Brad, yeah. When do you think you would come back to us with that? Just make sure everybody's comfortable with whatever that timeline is.
Yeah. So when we indicate in the memo the recommendation option 1 completion of Q1, Q3 for zoning, that was with the just as a reminder from our presentation, that was with the very specific items that were identified in the retreat earlier in the year. We would, as we just talked about with occupancy, we would plan to come forward with a work session in the early part of the year for zoning for affordable housing. And if in that discussion there was a decision to add more of these types of things that many of you are asking and suggesting are important to include in that, we would just want to make clear at this stage that would then push that completion time out. But there absolutely would be every opportunity to talk about including the list of items from Lauren's hotline and some of the other items discussed today.
So could we maybe ask for that to be in January, just so that we have enough time to evaluate and prioritize within that list and move forward?
Yeah, I'm going to have to check with Charles and Carl how much prep time was anticipated for that work session.
I mean, as we've stated in this discussion, my workload these days is very much heavy on development review. So we're having a new staff member start next week who will start to strip some of that away. But there are some things I am committed to that would be difficult to give up. So having a complete packet with all the information that council would expect for early January, we could certainly do it, but it just would not have the level of quality and analysis that council typically expects. I think that's why we were kind of letting that process of work strip away from development review to another case review, or me be able to then take these projects on, do the necessary groundwork to give as much good information as we can to council to make a good decision.
Yeah,
that's why we recommended later in Q1.
That was our hope, was either late Q1 or early Q2. We still have a little bit of onboarding to do with new staff next week, and then staff that's just started is still up and running, and we're still tying up loose ends on the site review code changes and the module 2 of use tables that we're trying to bring forward by the end of the year here. So there's a bit of a hustle that would prevent us from really getting a jump on what happens after the holidays, right, in January. So
thank you, gentlemen. Just to jump in and kind of contextualize that too, and agree with what they said. There was earlier some thought about capacity when we were talking about Boulder Junction and some of those. Just to clarify, we don't have the means, ability to move some of the staff that are in comprehensive planning to move over into these policy, because the time it would take them to get up to speed with these issues wouldn't benefit the overall time frame. So I just want to clarify that.
Thanks for that. So like on the matrix that we're looking at where it says zoning for affordable housing completion Q2 or 3, doesn't that mean that we would be voting on it in Q2 or Q3, those zoning changes? Because if we're not going to see even what we might want until the end of Q1 is ambitious and probably not Q2, it seems hard to, again, I'm just trying to play out a timeline of, we got 1 year left with this council. It seems like we wouldn't possibly get to that under this matrix realistically.
Only if it were that very narrow scope that was defined by council at the retreat. That's the assumption behind that. But you are correct. If the scope, if when we came at the end of Q1, Q2 with the study session, if the scope were expanded beyond the retreat level, then you're right, we would be pushing out beyond Q3 and Q4 or 2024. Barring some trade-offs, and again, I don't mean to revisit the module 3 thing, but that was probably the easiest thing to buy us a little more capacity.
Yep. Okay, maybe we'll all sleep on that and think of what how we maybe can shuffle when we get to the occupancy look or something. Okay, any other questions on question 3? And then we'll do a quick touch. I think question 2 is probably almost self-explanatory at this point, but anything else on this question? Okay, question 2, does council have further comments on the proposed scope of work, public engagement plan, and schedule for Boulder Junction phase 2? Any hands? No feedback on this one. Going once, twice, sold. Brad, you got what you need there?
I think so. Yeah, thank you.
All right, and do you have any questions from staff on any of the 3 questions that we've answered?
I feel like I do.
Clear as mud?
I think where things landed, if I can summarize, is looking at the chart here, delaying the Area 3 reserve to buy capacity on the comprehensive planning side of things. And then everything else more or less staying like the option 1 recommendations, but with a clear recognition that the occupancy and zoning for affordable housing scopes will be discussed as part of those work sessions early in the year. Is that a correct summary of things?
Any objections?
So option 1, good.
Tara, that didn't sound like an objection. Okay, let us move on then to item 3.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brad, and all the staff and everyone's patience for that. Nuria?
Sure.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. And I appreciate the previous conversation as well. I know it is hard. There's so many things we want to do. And I think we got what we needed here, where council would like us to try to get to. And please know that we will, as always, try to be as responsive as we can within the work that is coming to fruition and ending soon. But you've asked me to talk a little bit about elections today, and want to just make note that though the results yet are not certified unless I've somehow missed something while I've been in council. But the update as we know it and sort of our expected next steps on the ballot items is as follows. And I'll start with 2A and 2B, the climate tax issue. So Boulder voters have approved two measures, 2A and 2B, that will support climate action in the community. The climate tax itself is coming into effect, would go into effect on January 1st, 2023, and will replace the existing climate action plan, or CAP tax, and utility occupation taxes, or UOT. The changes will appear on future Xcel Energy utility bills for Boulder customers. In the short term, the city and Xcel Energy is working together to help energy customers understand those changes to their 2023 natural gas and electricity bills. So we want to make sure that kind of everyone knows that some changes are coming, and so we'll continue to communicate about that. City staff is going to begin rolling out an engagement process to better understand the needs and desires of community in this regard. The conversations with community members will help guide how existing tax dollars are invested, as well as large-scale investments that could be made locally. And in addition to providing critical funding for Boulder's climate work, the measure that was just approved, 1.5 million of the collected revenues is going to be used each year to accelerate wildfire resilience measures. We've already established a cross-departmental team to identify and prioritize enhanced actions that the city will be able to implement beginning in 2023 with increased wildfire resiliency funding. And actually, we expect to have a conversation with council in the early part of the next year as well. On even year elections, which is ballot item 2E, voters appear to have approved moving city elections to even years. The next step for that will be to modify our materials and processes to support this transition in 2023 and 2025 for 3-year terms as the ballot item specified. And then I just note that ballot 2D on city charter clarifications regarding candidate issues has also passed. On 2F, the CU South annexation, and just want to say we recognize that our community appears to favor maintaining that annexation agreement. Once the vote count is final, we're eager to continue work on South Boulder Creek flood mitigation and commit to prioritizing life and safety issues while keeping in mind the beauty and the value in this area. We will be working closely with CU throughout the process to ensure the terms of the annexation agreement are upheld. As we move forward, we remain committed to providing transparent and accurate information to our community. We're aware that there are strong and diverse views about the annexation, and we're committed to working on behalf of the whole community as we take next steps. Regarding the flood mitigation, it's a multi-year process, and we are eager to increase protections for this vulnerable part of our community as soon as possible. The design team is currently working at 60% design phase of the project, and I'm sure we'll be coming to council and keeping you apprised as that moves forward. Lastly, I'll say that on item 6C, the library districts, this continues to be a very close race. Close vote, I should say, and we'll be waiting the final results, but it appears that the district will be approved. The city is committed to making this transition as smooth as possible. The immediate next steps will be to have council amend the appropriation ordinance for reduction of the city's current 0.333 mill levy for the current dedication to the library, as we previously discussed. We'll also begin the process for the city and the county to appoint the initial board of directors, which requires 2 members of council to serve on a committee with 2 county commissioners. These scheduling requests will come to CAC on Monday. After the appointment and ratification of the initial board of trustees, the city will begin IGA negotiations with the district to finalize transition details. The city ballot item 2C, repealing the library items in the city charter, are also passed, which will support a smoother transition as we move forward. And I'll just say that during this entire time of transition, the city will continue to provide library services as a city department, and we are excited to break ground on the new North Boulder Branch Library in the very near future. So hopefully that addresses some of your questions about what's next.
It does. Thank you so much. I just wanted to make sure that the community had a sense of where we were after some important and also some contentious votes. So thank you for bringing us up to speed on that.
Appreciate that and apologize for the mouthful.
It was a mouthful. Well done. Are there any other questions for this evening? Otherwise, I believe I'll wait for a show of hands. Anybody have questions, debrief?
If I could, I just wanted to thank planning staff for sticking with us and just doing a phenomenal job on answering our questions, and looking forward to getting stuff done next year together.
Yahoo! That's a hard conversation because there's so much and we're all so passionate. So I agree. Thanks for saying that, Aaron. Thanks, everyone. And I'll be out next week, so have fun. Bye.
Thanks, Rachel.